Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to the Public Service Commission of South Carolina's hearing in dockets number 2019-264E and 2019-265E. Let's take roll. Present in the hearing room, we have Commissioner Caston, Vice Chair Belzer, and Chairman Williams. Joining us virtually, we have Commissioners Thomas, Irvin, and Powers. I believe witness Snyder had answered all questions from the parties, and now it is the commission's opportunity to ask witness Snyder questions. Any questions for witness Snyder?
Mr. Chairman?
Mr. Chairman.
Oh, I'm
Go
sorry,
ahead.
Mr. Breitschwert. Mr. Chairman, I have one quick procedural question, if I may ask you and the rest of the commission.
Is that Attorney Andrew Bateman for ORS?
Yes, sir, it is. I apologize for not introducing myself. Yes, sir, Mr. Chairman. This is Andrew Bateman with ORS.
Please proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Earlier this morning, I learned that two ORS witnesses, witness Collin and witness Barron, will be unavailable to testify this Wednesday due to those two witnesses being called to testify in a hearing in Kentucky. And in the event the proceeding progresses such that those two witnesses would otherwise be called to testify on Wednesday, I would respectfully request that they be given the opportunity to testify on Thursday. I sent an email this morning to all parties requesting that if anyone had any objections, they let me know. I have not heard any objections to this point, but I would like to raise the issue for your consideration, Mr. Chairman.
All right. I'm sorry, one second. Vice Chair Belzer? Attorney Bateman, could you identify the witnesses that are unable to testify on Wednesday, please?
Absolutely, Mr. Chairman. It's witness Collin and witness Barron.
Collin and Barron.
Yes, sir.
All right. Any objection to witness Collin or witness Barron, or witness Collin and witness Barron not testifying on Wednesday, but Thursday or someday thereafter? All right. Hearing no objections, your request is granted, Attorney Bateman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Breitschwert.
All right. Is there
Mr.
anything?
Chairman, apologize. This is Brett Breitschwert on behalf of Duke Energy. Very briefly, if I could, Mr. Chairman, you may recall during Mr. Spear's examination, there was some questions towards the end about a North Carolina data request response that raised the potential for the companies to be pursuing an RFP. And Mr. Spear didn't have that data request readily available. Over the lunch hour, the company's attorneys were able to obtain the data request that we believe Mr. Spear was generically referencing. I've circulated that to Ms. Wessinger Hill as well as all the parties' attorneys. And if it would be okay with the commission, the companies would like to enter that data request into the record and allow Mr. Snyder a very brief opportunity to respond to it, having a chance to review it. I've not spoken with him. I've not shared it with him at this point, as I understand that's not proper in South Carolina, but would ask that to be a hearing exhibit so the commission has the information that was generically referenced in the prior examination.
All right. And what's the name of that data request?
Yes, sir. If I may, I'll share it here and you view it. If I can share the apologies, let me get the right document to share.
Mr. Chairman, Taylor Spear, Vote Solar. If there's going to be an opportunity to question the witness, I would ask for obviously the opportunity to cross, and I may not take advantage of that if it's permitted, but I just wanted to note there that I would like the opportunity to address any issues that arise.
Noted.
And Duke Energy wouldn't oppose that, Mr. Chairman. We just want to make sure the record's clear and that Mr. Snyder has the opportunity to provide a clear response to the commission. So it would be the North Carolina Public Staff data request 3-27 from docket number E100 sub 165, the North Carolina IRP proceeding that's ongoing now.
All right. If you would enlarge that document for us, please, sir. And so
Yes,
North
sir.
Carolina Public Staff data request will be marked and entered into the record as hearing exhibit 7.
Thank you. And if I could just ask Mr. Snyder a few questions about it very briefly, we can then put it into the record and move on.
Yes, sir. Please proceed.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Snyder, do you see the data request that I have here on the screen has been entered in as a hearing exhibit?
Yes, I do.
And the format the company uses, they identify the responsible person for data requests, and that
I'm sorry
responsible person.
to interrupt, but if you would enlarge that document further for us, please.
Yes, sir. Is that
Yes, sir. Perfect. Thank you. Please continue.
all right? Thank you. And I've highlighted the gentleman's name who was responsible for this data request. And do you see that?
I do.
Okay, and so that's Mr. Niehaus, who is not you, obviously. Do you know if you had a chance to review this data request before it was issued?
I am looking at it now. I don't recall if I specifically reviewed that before it was issued, but I understand what's contents are contained in it.
Okay, and just to read the request, it's asking for DE please provide a project development timeline to engineer and build the identified need in 2026 for 457 megawatts of CT capacity as shown in its winter LCR table associated with the base case with carbon policy portfolio. So with that being the request, can you explain the response that was provided?
Yes, Mr. Niehaus is a project manager and provided a high level in this response timeline for the process of going through a CPCN and engineering, constructing, building, and putting into service a resource from a very high level perspective. And this looks to be like a high level timeline that's consistent with his expertise in project management.
And would you agree with me that this is just representative of a generic timeline to develop a CT for a 2026 in-service date?
Yes, that is a generic timeline.
All right, thank you. Mr. Chairman, no further questions. Thank you for allowing the companies to put this exhibit into the record.
Any questions from Attorney Spear?
Taylor Spear for Vote Solar. Thank you for asking no questions, Mr. Chairman.
Any questions from any of the other parties? If you would, sir, please unshare your document. All right, Commissioner questions.
Mr. Chairman, Delton Powers.
Commissioner Powers, you have the floor, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Snyder, now we're looking at North Carolina things. And I've had this question in the back of my mind when I was reading that you had, I think you had found reserve margins of 17%. And that's based on the possibility of winter weather and certain risk. I think you call it, in fact, it's called the winter reserve margin. And I know you're doing the same process in North Carolina at the same time you're doing it here, or roughly the same time. Do you consider the weather in South Carolina to be the same as the weather in North Carolina? Is this just one study that covers both states, or is there a separate calculation done for the winter reserve in South Carolina?
Thank you, Commissioner Powers. The companies operate, each of the companies operate balancing areas that cover both states. So the resources and the load we serve are spread across both North and South Carolina. And so when we study, whether it's the IRP or resource adequacy, we're looking at our entire service territory. So it's not a specific North Carolina or South Carolina. It takes the weather, and Witness Wintermantle can answer detailed questions on this, Commissioner, but it takes the weather and it looks at multiple weather stations across the company's service territory, and it weights them proportional to the load that's being served in that area. So sorry for the long-winded answer, but it does look across both North and South Carolina as a single study, taking into account weather across the service territory.
So you think it's fair to apply North Carolina weather to South Carolina weather? I mean, there's a difference in a lot of areas.
There really is, Commissioner, and this is sort of a very important point that goes beyond just this study. The companies do not develop individual plans for North Carolina and South Carolina. They do not study the operations of the system for North Carolina and South Carolina. The studies, all studies that we do within IRP recognize our what's called a FERC balancing area, and Witness Roberts can share some more detail on that. But as we operate our grid minute to minute, hour to hour, day to day, we are using resources from across North and South Carolina to serve all customers in North and South Carolina, irrespective of where the resource is and where the customer is. So you get some tremendous benefits of economy of scale by having this big footprint. But you operate your system and you study your system as a system. So if it's really cold in North Carolina and really a little bit warmer in South Carolina, those are both taken into consideration. We're planning for the total load. So that is all looked at a system level across both jurisdictions. And that's how the company operates its system, and how the company studies its system is by it's what's called its balancing authority, which is the footprint, its regulated footprint that covers both states.
You said, I think in your opening remarks, or maybe your attorney did, that there were, of course, some differences because of the different approaches or different statutory requirements by each commission. Will those be identified out for us as we go along here? Apparently, most of your studies are going to be for your entire area, not anything specific for us.
That's correct, Commissioner. And some of the differences I think we've spoken about might be particular aspects of the plan that South Carolina require. There's a lot of overlap between the types of things that are supposed to be studied under South Carolina Act 62 and under North Carolina IRP rules. And so there's a lot of overlap within each of the two states, but there are some differences. We have an appendix, I believe it's Appendix O in our IRP, that is a cross-reference table that goes through the North Carolina filing requirements, each and every one, and references where in the IRP you can see compliance with that particular aspect. We also have that cross-reference table for Act 62 and the requirements of the utility under Act 62. And in Appendix O, it references which section of the IRP deals with that particular requirement within the Act. So we understand there's a lot of requirements in both, and we wanted to provide a way to more readily, without reading front to back 400 pages, if you have a particular area of interest, that cross-reference table may be useful to you, sir.
It just, I couldn't help but think about, there was a young man from Blenheim, South Carolina years ago who was an outstanding basketball recruit. And when he announced where he was going to school, he picked North Carolina State. He said he always wanted to go to school up north. So, thank you so much for clearing that up.
Yeah. Yes, sir.
Commissioner questions? Commissioner Caston?
Good afternoon, Mr. Snyder.
Good afternoon, Commissioner.
On page 15 of your direct testimony, lines 14 through 17, I just made a note on my copy, and I was just curious where you talked about assumption of further pricing declines, and I think that was relative to storage, battery storage. What did you base your assumptions of further pricing declines on? I mean, is there some study out there, or was it just pulled out of the air? I mean, where did that come from?
No, that's a good question, and I'm going to give you a quick answer, subject to check. And witness Kalimba is got a lot of that in his testimony, but we do use specific studies for these. I believe Navigant is a study that we depended on, and witness Kalimba can correct me if I've misstated there. But those price declines that we hope to see come from third-party studies.
Okay, thank you. Further on, I think the next page, I was looking at the tables that you had on the screen, or someone put up on the screen. And I'm a table guy, so those were very helpful and useful to me. So, although the print was kind of small, but that could be my copy. I did notice, I think it was footnote 2 or 3, I can't recall which one it was, where it talks about the PV, the present value assumes no direct carbon tax. If there was
Yes,
a carbon tax, it would be collected through revenue requirements, and I'm assuming that means passed on to the customer, correct?
That is correct, sir.
Now, am I correct in assuming, like in the IRP, and I also think in that particular note, it said this would add about 11 billion to 16 billion if carbon tax added. Is that correct?
Yes, sir. And from a resource planning perspective, there's two potential policy paths you could look at. One would be sort of the easiest to understand would be a direct tax, like every ton of carbon emitted would have a tax with it. And that then would add to the cost of that fuel. So gas units have less carbon than a coal unit, and obviously nuclear, solar would be carbon free. So it really would be a function of the carbon emitted from your fossil units. And you can view that as that direct tax, or another form of legislation is more of either a mass cap, what they call a mass cap, or a cap and trade, where potentially your given allowances, you're not directly taxed for that carbon. And as long as you operate your fleet within a certain cap, you don't actually pay the direct cost, but you're sending what we call a shadow price or a price signal, so that you're operating your fleet in a manner that will keep you under that cap. So that would not be a direct cost in a mass cap or an allowance situation, but rather an indirect. So we show it both ways in the IRP. If it was more of a mass cap or an allowance and not a direct tax, you still have to operate the fleet in a different manner to account for carbon prices. And so that's in there, but the tax is not. And if it is a tax, then those are the costs that footnote was speaking to.
Okay, thank you. That answers that question. Also, I think on page 17, you talked about this acceleration, I think, accelerating the retirement of the coal facility. And it said this acceleration assumes use of existing infrastructure, which I think was transmission capacity, gas pipeline, access to cooling water, and such as that. Is that correct?
Yes,
Is that in both base cases, base case with and without?
No, it's a good question. In that summary table, you'll notice, Commissioner, we had two different sets of retirements. We had an economic retirement, and we had a set of retirement dates that were more accelerated called earliest practicable. Mm-hmm. And I believe that's on page 16 of the IRP. Mm-hmm. You'll see that in that table, or 16 of, if you happen to have my direct testimony, it's cross exhibit 2, page 16. And so the 6 different portfolios envision 3 of them have the most economic retirement date, and 3 have the earliest practicable. The most economic retirement date was driven by a detailed study of when do we believe at this point in time, based on the facts and circumstances we know today, when will it be economic to retire the coal plant? And the earliest practicable sets aside the when is it the most economic and simply asks the question of how early could you get out of coal if economics were not a consideration? And the key there is you still have to be able to physically construct the resources to reliably replace those, even in the earliest practicable dates. So to get to the earliest practicable date and avoid the need for incremental infrastructure, more transmission, siting near cooling, the way that was looked at is you would replace the generation on site where the existing coal unit was being retired, and that would allow a more expeditious retirement of the unit. So only in those earliest practicable dates did we assume replacement on site. For the economic, we did not assume that we were going to be replacing it on site. We looked at it just from a generic replacement resource and said, that is what's going to drive those dates. So I hope that answered your question.
I think it does, but and as I recall, and I may be incorrect, that the earliest quickest time was like 9 years or something like that. And that would require, well, in every scenario, I think it required using natural gas in lieu of, correct?
Now, we actually have natural gas and storage as replacements. You do have to have a reliable resource that, what I mean by that, we'll get more into that as the week goes on, but is a capacity resource that's capable of being dispatched across your winter peak and replacing the coal that was serving that winter morning peak. And so we have in our portfolios a mix of DSM, storage, and gas units that replace that coal facility. We do not have solar replacing that coal facility because it's not available at time of winter morning peak.
Right, that I understood as far as across the 6, but I guess I was thinking in terms of in the quickest case to eliminate the coal, it would require using the natural gas. Did I understand that correctly, or did I not understand that correctly?
No, and by and large, that is the quickest way to get there is to put a gas unit and use that substation infrastructure, that cooling water, that land, by and large. And I was going to it now to see if I could look at the exact replacement dates, and that is our portfolio C. Yes, we do have even in portfolio C, we do have a fair amount of energy storage. So I would say it's a combination of gas units replacing that coal and energy storage.
Okay.
In that summary table, you'll see 2,200 megawatts of incremental energy storage.
Okay, but moving on, I think to the 70% CO2 reduction plan, which I think was D. I didn't write it down when I was going through the stuff.
No, that's fine.
But you talk about using accelerated coal retirement, aggressive DSM, additional solar, but they're not enough to achieve the 70% reduction. Offshore wind, North Carolina, South Carolina would be added, but you talk about gas generation would need to be leveraged to accelerate coal retirement and backstand the increased renewables of the system. What does that mean? I think I know, but I'm not sure.
No, that's a very good question, and one I know is of debate in this proceeding, but as you're retiring these coal units that during a winter peak event might run full out for a week. Now, they might not run much over the course of a year, but over the course of a week, they're running significantly to meet that event. As you're retiring those that were running full out, you're replacing them with batteries and solar and wind that has variable output, and it requires the system to move and backfill those resources as they ramp up and down. And gas plants are much more flexible than coal units. They can ramp faster, they can follow load faster, and as you add more intermittent resources to your grid, you need a combination of those gas plants and storage to be able to fulfill that backstanding, what we call backstanding of the renewables, to account for the times when the wind's not blowing and the sun is not shining.
So basically, this is dispatchable. You need dispatchable
It is
energy
dispatchable.
for those sources that aren't dispatchable, that aren't always there. And is that correct?
Two concepts, dispatchable, and they're also not energy limited.
Okay.
So batteries have a limit to their runtime over, a number of hours. So they're dispatchable and they help, and then we have batteries in, but there are energy limits to how much output they can continuously put out. And so you want a certain amount of that. And again, we support storage in our resource plans, but you need a certain amount of resources that don't have those energy limitations.
Okay, so you're saying it's not only dispatchable, but it can run 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year.
Well, it can run 24 hours a day for a number of days. It's really, can they cover a peak event? Many of our turbines are not permitted to run base load around the year, and they're not needed for that. Their existence in the fleet is what we call top of stack or are peaking. That's why they're sometimes called peakers. So they are not, to be clear, permitted to run 8760, which is the number of hours in a year. But they are permitted to run, multiple days in a row if needed, to retain system reliability.
To go through these winter periods, winter vortexes or whatever.
That's correct, sir.
Okay. Also, I can't remember where I saw it. It was, I think, somewhere in the IRP and in your testimony where you talk about expanded pump hydro, adding, what do you mean by expanded pump hydro?
So Duke operates two of the larger pumped hydro facilities in the country, Jocassee and Bad Creek in South Carolina.
Mm-hmm.
Very high level, you've got two ponds, one at a high level, one at a lower level. And during off-peak hours, you pump it up and put it in the high reservoir. It flows down, turns a turbine, creates electricity, and flows into the lower reservoir. So it's a battery per se, although it has a longer duration. I think 24 hours maybe instead of 4, 12 to 24, depending on how you look at it. And so that, when we say expanding pump hydro, we have a current process in place at Bad Creek to upgrade our existing pumped hydro as we're doing its runner-up rates. And so we're getting in the IRP 230 extra megawatts, about 65 a year over the next 4 years from enhancing that facility to get more output out of it. So that's one area where we talk about enhanced pumped hydro. And then in some of our scenarios, we show later at the tail end of our resource plan the potential to add additional pumped hydro facility to the fleet.
So you're talking about, at Bag Creek, for example, is that increasing the reservoir or just the generators or the pump size or combination of all three, and then looking at other reservoirs to pump to?
Yeah, the uprates are the latter, sir. So that's a very good question. It is, you're not changing the reservoirs, you're just making the turbines capable of putting more electricity through. So you may lose a little bit of your duration to get more output, but you're getting more megawatts of storage across your peak. And so that 6,500 or 65 megawatts times 4, the 230 megawatts is increasing that generator on that. The other one I talked about was later in the plan was a all new reservoir. So, you know, it could be new reservoirs, it could be uprates, new turbines at existing reservoirs, but no decision's been made on that. It's just looking at the potential as a long-term resource later in the plan.
Thank you. In the no new gas scenario, I think scenario 6, you talk about toward the end the unprecedented levels of storage that are required to support significantly higher levels of variable energy resources present increased system risk. Let's see, you're going to say there is no utility experience for winter peaking utilities in the U.S. or abroad with operational protocols to manage this scale of dependence on short-term energy storage. Explain that.
So we see energy storage and battery storage as a promising technology. We've considered a range of it as anticipated in the Act, as you can see, between the portfolios between 1 and 7,000 megawatts. But to put that into perspective, battery storage as a commercial resource to the utility industry is very, very nascent. I think I was looking at some EIA data a little while ago, and you know, just a couple of years ago, there was 800 megawatts nationwide. Then I think it went up to 1,400 megawatts, probably about the time we were, performing the IRP. And I think we're slightly over 2,000 megawatts across the country today. So what I mean by that is, you know, it's one thing to model these resources. It's another thing to have operational experience with these, and no one in the country has 7,400 megawatts worth of batteries on their system. And then winter, and what I meant by the winter comment is each area of the country has very different load obligations. So a winter event is very different than a summer event in a lot of respects. And so you have to look at the resource fit given the need, the consumer need in the future. So what we meant by that is an aggressive assumption at this point in time, given the nascent level of the current battery storage market as it relates to utility scale operation of battery storage, not EV batteries or other applications, but as assets on a utility grid.
Makes sense. Okay, thank you. Also, I think on page 22 of your testimony, you state that 5 of the 6 resource plans require technological and or policy advancements in order to implement on the timeline presented in the RPs. So am I understanding that to say without, I guess, technology advancements and or policy advancements, only one of the 6 scenarios can meet the timeline, and I'm assuming that's the base?
Yes, Commissioner, in my opening comments with Mr. Breitschwart, I was explaining that bottom graphic there, those on that page, those Harvey balls, as I called them. And it is difficult to put in, you know, I'm a math guy, so I'd like to put it into an exact number, but as you can see, as you move from that base case portfolio to the right, you have an increasing reliance on technologies that are emergent. So offshore wind, small modular reactors, storage, as we just spoke about. So those technologies, we're going to continue to learn in the months, years to come, how those develop, what their costs are, what their performance characteristics are, how they can perform on a utility system. And all that those Harvey balls represent is that the technology needs to advance, and some of that technology advancement, you know, will be dependent upon supported policy, whether that's investment tax credits, whether that's production tax credits, whether that's carbon regulation that puts a cap and trade that makes the relative economics of that resource more competitive to other resources. So the further you go in those portfolios, it just emphasizes that those are the types of things that will need to happen, you know, to support that portfolio.
Yes, sir, I understand that, and I saw the little dark circles and thought that was very graphic.
Commissioner Caston, I hate to interrupt this conversation, but I would just say if it's helpful to you at all at any point during your examination, I'd be glad to put that back on the screen for Mr. Snyder to reference or for you to reference. So please don't hesitate to ask for that if that would be helpful.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm looking at mine, so if you don't have to, if you don't want to. Getting back to that again, I want to make sure I understand it, and I'm not being critical one way or the other, but it says technological and or policy advancements in order to implement the timeline presented in the IRPs. If I'm understanding that correctly, it's based on, I guess, whatever your model says and whatever assumptions you have to make about technologies advancing to some level or hypothetical level, that the timelines are only achievable if the advancements in technology and the policy advancements occur in a relatively, I wouldn't say brief time, but those things need to occur or the other things can't occur. Is that true or false?
Yeah, that is true, sir. Just to say, you asked a good question earlier about declining, or I'm sorry, it might have been another commissioner that asked battery prices. We expect them, we use a model, you know, we expect them to decline, but those technology advancements have to prove themselves out. You couldn't go purchase a battery today at those lower prices. Those technology advancements can be spurred by DOE funding. They can be spurred by tax credits. And all we're saying is that as you go to these more nascent technologies, that the technology itself and the supporting policies, we are assuming are going to need to progress it the way we see in the plan in order to be able to implement that plan.
Understand, makes sense. I'm about finished. I was looking at resource adequacy, where you talked about what resource adequacy is, which is in essence is what you're doing here. And it didn't leap out at me. It was probably there and I missed it. But resource adequacy, is that just generation capacity, or is that generation capacity, transmission, distribution? Is that all that stuff combined as far as you guys are concerned?
Yeah, you're right in the purest sense that it does take the generation, transmission, and distribution grid to provide that reliability. When we do a resource adequacy study, we're focusing on the generation portion of it. And so witness Wintermantle, who is an external witness for the company, whose consulting firm, Astrape Consulting, performs those studies for us, can answer detailed questions on this. But from a 10,000-foot view, you do these resource adequacy studies that are very complex statistical studies to say, hey, the IRP is based on normal weather and normal operating conditions. Do you have enough resource adequacy to withstand abnormal weather? Think, polar vortex, ERCOT, etc. And it runs lots of statistical analysis to say what is the appropriate level of resource adequacy, and then it converts it into a simple capacity reserve margin calculation that can be used in an IRP framework and more readily explained to stakeholders than going through the detail by detail of a resource adequacy study, which you'll have the opportunity to do with Witness Wintermantle should you desire.
Okay, that was one of the things that caught my attention when I was looking at the different scenarios you guys laid out when you were talking about when you retire the coal plant, that the existing infrastructure, the transmission lines, the stuff coming from that plant is useful. And whatever you do, you would like to do it at that location to use or utilize that existing transmission. And I guess.
Yeah, there's certainly synergies there. And again, we didn't want to presume it. You're going to hear a lot about it over the course of the next week. The IRP does not assume Duke ownership. And we didn't want, had we assumed Duke ownership of all assets, we would have made all retirement plants be replacing on site. The only reason we replaced on site in the earliest practicable is it avoids the need for that new infrastructure. So it's quick. You could, without building new transmission lines, without the siting process, you could replace on site. And so that's the only time when we did earliest practical where we assumed, in essence, a utility owned asset going back at the plant. In the economic retirement dates, we just put a generic CT or CC into the resource plan and did not assume those economies were in place.
I understand, although they do matter.
They do.
And getting to reserve margin, I read your formula. And I guess the example that came to my head, say 150 megawatts, is the total resources you have, and your weather peak or whatever weather situation to say is 120 megawatts. Is that 150 minus 120 divided by 120? I think it's like 0.25 or 25%. Is that the reserve margin?
That you are you're a quick learner. That is exactly.
I followed your equation.
Yeah, installed capacity less peak demand. So how much extra do I have over my peak demand? And it's important. This is something that we'll hear throughout that I think it's really important to understand is we plan to what's called a weather normal peak. So the IRP, when it says, what is my peak summer, my peak winter demand, that's not the peak that we might have to serve. That's a weather normal peak based on 30 years of weather data. It's the average peak conditions, not average over the year, but like an average peak condition. It's not the highest that we've seen or the highest that we could see. So a reserve margin allows for two things. It allows for perturbation in load due to extreme weather, and it covers an amount of resource outages. Not an entire fleet of resources, no matter what resource type you've got, is going to be fully operating at time of peak. So there's a process that the statistical analysis goes through to say you are going to have a certain amount of units offline and you're going to have really high load because of this weather, and you need adequate reserve margin to cover that excess. Real quickly, in the industry, you might hear the word capacity margin. It's simply doing that same calculation in the numerator but dividing by installed capacity rather than your peak load. So there's two different terms used in the industry: reserve margin, capacity margin. It's simply a matter of which one is your denominator.
That was very helpful. Thank you. So is this a fairly standard or common methodology used across the industry?
The reserve margin and capacity margin is very standard. I think as noted by even the ORS witnesses, the ELCC is what are LOLE calculations, loss of load expectation calculations, resource adequacy studies using a loss of load expectation approach is also an industry standard. It's growing. It's very sophisticated. It's a little more difficult for small utilities to have the resources to be able to model. So it's not universally used, but most of the leading utilities do use a loss of load expectation study to help inform and develop their reserve margin calculation.
Thank you very much. Finally, as I look at my very tiny print copy of your table, as I go across the present value, I think it was your present value revenue requirement, you
Yes,
guys
sir.
called it. Scenario 1, I'm starting from left to right, I guess scenario A, B, C, D, E, F, was 79.8 billion. B was 82.5 billion. C was 84.1 billion. D was 100.5 billion. E was 95.5 billion. And F, no gas generation and everything else, was 108.1 billion. And I think it was on the other table. I think they had the average monthly.
For each of the utilities.
Right. And as I look at the percentages, I'm assuming that's 30-year and 35-year percent carbon reduction. Is that correct?
That is, sir, from a 2005 baseline.
Right, from the 2005 base. There are differences, some marginally, but those costs are based on your model and the assumptions of the technology and the everything else, correct?
That is correct.
Okay. I think that's it. Thank you very much, Mr. Snyder.
You're welcome.
Mr. Chairman, this is Commissioner Thomas.
Commissioner Thomas, you have the floor, sir.
Thank you. Mr. Snyder, so early on, you made a comment about a change to your testimony where you wanted to strike something to the effect of does not account for end-of-life disposal costs.
Yes, sir.
Do you remember that? Can you explain to me what that was referring to? I must not have taken very good notes. I can't get back and figure out exactly where you are and what you're talking about.
Certainly, sir. That was a small change to the IRP itself, which I sponsored as Exhibits 1 in my testimony. And through the extensive discovery, we talked about, 3,200 discovery questions. One of the detailed discovery from the ORS, when we looked into it with our subject matter expert, we actually did have a small value put in for disposal costs. And when we wrote the IRP, we didn't realize that had been in there. So we struck, we said we'd look at it in the future, and we will continue to look at the disposal cost of batteries as they become known and measurable. But we did have a placeholder in our analytic number, and the words on the page implied that we did not. So we wanted to, out of an abundance of clarity, trying to be very transparent, we wanted to strike that, and we'll file those redacted pages, or those amended pages, excuse me, to the IRP.
Okay, and what sort of disposal costs does that relate to?
So with all plants, there's an end of life cost that we assume, in the model that is like just a general decommissioning cost. And subject to check, there's lots of numbers in the IRP and I don't want to misquote one, but subject to check, I think we're in the neighborhood of about 8% of its installed cost, but on nominal dollars at the end of life, right? So you put in a disposal cost that says at the end of life, you're gonna have a decommissioning cost. You're gonna have to spend some dollars to remediate that plant or that resource, whatever it is, wind or solar or a gas plant or a battery. And, those costs are hard to know a long time from now, but you need to put a placeholder in to recognize there is a end of life cost to decommission those assets. And we had originally written the IRP as though we had excluded that in the batteries, but our economic analyst that did the work said, no, he did put that 8% in there. Whether, over time, we'll continue to evaluate whether that's the right number or not.
Okay, thank you. So let me ask a question about the table on page 16. It's about I guess it's the third section down, and it relates to the average annual percentage change in residential bills. And under the column F, the right-hand side, no new gas generation. Looks like that by far is the most expensive way to go in terms of what customers are paying for. Can you just kind of walk me through that a little bit to help me understand at a high level why it's so expensive to not use any gas generation? I think I probably know, but would like to hear.
And again, you get the greatest carbon reduction, but you're relying on, emerging technologies that are even, and to be clear, to follow up on an earlier question, we do build in cost declines, and we're hopeful that we see those in the industry. We certainly have seen it in the early stages of solar development. We've seen significant drops. So we're hoping to see that with offshore wind, with batteries, with small modular reactors. So we build in sort of a learning curve. But even with those learning curves, when you rely on these emerging technologies in the volumes that are needed to reliably replace the coal plants, it is a more expensive path than utilizing natural gas for part of that portfolio. And again, it's always the mix, and it's what percentage mix of what resources are we using. But if you go with a offshore wind and high battery scenario, it's just more expensive than some of the other scenarios. But it does give you, the quicker trajectory on carbon reductions, and it's showing that trade-off.
Okay, thank you. That's all I had.
All right. Any other questions for this witness? Okay. Sir, you may step down.
Thank you, Chairman.
Applicant, you want to call your next witness?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. At this time, the companies will call Mr. Sammy Roberts to the stand, and if we could just have about 3 minutes to get him set up, please, we will be then ready to go.
Well, how about we do this? Let's take a 15-minute break and come back at 3:20.
Thank you, sir.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Public Service Commission of South Carolina. We're here today in dockets number 2019-264E and 2019-265E. Let's take roll. Present in the hearing room, we have Commissioner Caston, Vice Chair Belzer, and Chairman Williams. Joining us virtually, we have Commissioners Powers, Irvin, and Thomas. The applicant was calling the next witness to the stand. Is that witness ready?
Yes, sir. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is Brett Braceward on behalf of the Duke Companies again. The companies call Mr. Sammy Roberts to the stand. Good afternoon, Mr. Roberts.
Good afternoon.
Would you please state your full name?
Mr. Roberts and Attorney
Yes, sir.
Bressowitz, I need to swear the witness.
Thank you, sir. I'll probably get that by the next time. I apologize. I keep jumping the gun.
No worries. Appreciate your eagerness. Mr. Roberts, do you solemnly affirm the testimony you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, sir?
Yes, sir.
All right. Thank you, sir. Please proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Roberts, would you please state your full name for the record?
My name is Dewey S. Roberts II. I go by Sammy.
Thank you. And by whom are you employed and in what capacity?
I'm currently employed by Duke Energy as General Manager, Transmission Planning and Operations Strategy.
And how long have you been employed by Duke Energy?
I have over 3 decades of electric utility experience starting in 1990 and over 2 decades of system operations experience, all with Duke Energy or one of its predecessor utilities.
And how long have you been employed by Duke Energy in power systems operations roles where you have direct responsibility for ensuring compliance with NERC reliability standards?
I've been in roles of increasing responsibility for ensuring NERC reliability standard compliance since the NERC reliability standards became mandatory and enforceable in June of 2007. In July 2020, I transitioned to my current role, responsible for transmission planning and operations strategy.
Thank you, Mr. Roberts. Did you also cause to be pre-filed in this docket direct testimony consisting of 20 pages?
Yes, I did.
And do you have any changes to your direct testimony at this time?
No, I do not.
And if I was to ask you the same questions today that appear in your pre-filed direct testimony, would your answers be the same?
Yes.
Mr. Chairman, I'd ask at this time that Mr. Roberts' pre-filed direct testimony be entered in the record as if given orally from the stand.
Mr. Roberts' pre-filed direct testimony will be entered into the record as if given orally from the stand.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Roberts, did you pre-file any exhibits in support of your direct testimony?
No, I did not.
Thank you. Mr. Roberts, I'd like to now walk you through your direct testimony and would ask you to provide a brief summary to the commission. I'd like to start on pages 3 through 5, where you provide an overview of the purpose of your direct testimony. Can you please summarize that part of your testimony for the commission?
Yes. My direct testimony provides the commission an overview of the grid-related analysis and planned investment, especially the transmission investment associated with the 6 portfolios discussed in DEC's and DEP's 2020 IRPs and introduced by witness Snyder. My direct testimony also demonstrates the company's compliance with Act 62, which requires the companies to provide a summary of the planned transmission investments in the IRPs. This transmission investment information is presented in more detail in Chapter 7 of the DEC and DEP IRPs.
Thank you. I'd like to move to pages 5 through 15 of your direct testimony, where you describe this planned transmission investment needed to support the 6 portfolios presented in the IRPs. Can you please summarize that testimony for the commission?
Yes, it is important to highlight for the commission that the level of transmission investment the companies must undertake during the 15-year planning period is correlated to the amount and pace of generation retirement, especially coal retirements, and the type and location of replacement generation being interconnected with the grid. Retiring existing coal facilities that support the grid and integrating incremental resources forecasted in the IRPs will require significant transmission system investment. As described in Chapter 11 of the DEC and DEP IRPs, if replacement generation that can provide similar ancillary services as well as real power needs is not located at the site of the retiring coal facility, more significant transmission investments will be required to accommodate the unit's retirement in order to maintain grid stability. Furthermore, I explained that a range of additional transmission network upgrades will be required depending on the type and location of the replacement generation being interconnected with the grid. My direct testimony generally explains the nature of these projects and associated costs as they relate to the various portfolios proposed in the IRPs.
Thank you. And can you provide the commission with more specific detail on the potential transmission investments for each portfolio presented in the company's IRPs?
Yes, at this time, I'd like to direct the commission to Table 1 and Table 2 on page 6 of my direct testimony, and I'll ask my attorney to put these tables up on the WebEx. Thank you. This summary analysis shows planned coal retirements by portfolio in the first row, planned incremental generation by resource type during the planning period in rows 2 through 7, and in the bottom row, it shows the projected transmission investment associated with each portfolio. The key takeaways from these tables is that the need for transmission investment varies by portfolio, with the least cost base without CO2 policy portfolio requiring the lowest amount of transmission investment for both DEC and DEP. You can see in the bottom row, second column, that this is projected to be $600 million in DEC and $400 million in DEP. In DEC, the high wind portfolio would require the most new transmission investment at $4.3 billion. In DEP, the no new gas portfolio would require the most new transmission investment at $6.2 billion. This would be 10 times what is required for achieving the least cost base without CO2 policy in DEP.
Thank you, Mr. Roberts. I'd like to turn to pages 15 to 20 of your direct testimony where you provide support for other planned grid investments presented in the company's IRPs. Can you please summarize that testimony for the commission at this time?
Yes. I explained that the company's grid is not set up for the realities of future power flows and customer usage patterns, which is also addressed throughout the IRPs and discussed by witness Snyder. In my direct testimony, I described a few of the technologies necessary for the grid to meet the demands of tomorrow, such as battery storage and voltage control systems.
Can you provide specific detail on the grid-related technologies that you addressed in your direct testimony?
Yes. My testimony and the IRPs discuss integrating grid-connected storage into DEC and DEP systems. We have already begun investing in grid-connected storage systems with plans for more. The systems will be dispersed throughout North and South Carolina service territories and could be located on property owned by the companies or leased from customers. These deployments will allow for a more complete evaluation of potential benefits to the distribution, transmission, and generation systems, while also providing a better understanding of actual operation and maintenance cost impacts of batteries deployed on a significant scale. The companies have also been working with stakeholders to assess challenges and develop recommendations related to retrofit of existing solar facilities with energy storage as directed by the NCUC. Finally, the companies engaged Astrape Consulting to perform a study to assess the incremental change in effective load carrying capability of battery storage as more batteries are added to the system. This study, further described in Chapter 6, Appendix H, and Attachment 4 of the IRPs. Witness Wintermantle from Astrape provides a detailed discussion of that study in his testimony. My testimony and the IRPs also discuss integrated voltage VAR control, commonly known as IVVC. This technology involves the coordinated control of distribution equipment in substations and on distribution lines to optimize voltages and power factors on the distribution grid. The IVVC program also aids in peak load reduction. IVVC is expected to be fully implemented in DEC by 2025. Table 3 on page 17 of my testimony outlines the benefits of IBVC in the DEC service territory and includes energy and capacity savings and grid management benefits for the integration of distributed energy technologies. DEP currently utilizes a voltage reduction program called DSDR, or Distribution System Demand Response. For DEP, our IRP included discussion of the impact on peak load reduction from converting DSDR to IBVC functionality. The DEP IRP explains that further analysis of the lost peak shaving capability of retiring DSDR would be required, and that this analysis is ongoing. I would be glad to answer any questions the Commission may have regarding these programs and investments or any other aspect of my testimony.
Thank you, Mr. Roberts. Mr. Chairman, Mr. Roberts is available for examination by the parties and questions by the Commission on his direct testimony. We will be presenting his his rebuttal testimony at a later time.
All right, thank you, sir. Carolina's Clean Energy Business Association.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, this is John Burns for CCBA. I just have a couple of questions for this witness.
All right, sir, please proceed.
Mr. Roberts, I just have a couple of questions related to the pages 15 and 16 of your testimony, your direct testimony, where you talk about, as you've testified, about the grid investments required for the different scenarios. And you discuss the grid-connected storage systems. You, on the top of page 16, you discuss that the deployments of grid-connected storage systems will allow for a more complete evaluation of potential benefits to the distribution, transmission, and generation system, while also providing actual operation and maintenance cost impacts of batteries deployed at a significant scale. So those are studies that Duke is undertaking to take a look at the issue of distributed storage. Is that right?
It's both studies and looking at actual deployments.
Okay. If I understand your testimony, you're stating that because Duke would be taking down or shutting down the coal plants, and generation would occur elsewhere on the footprint of either of the territories, that additional transmission investments would be needed in order to bring those new generation assets online. Is that a fair summary of your testimony?
Yes, we're both the coal retirements, removing coal generation from that location, and putting generation elsewhere or resources elsewhere on the system, change the power flows on the system. And as you know, with interconnection requests, you go through the interconnection process, you're given a power flow study, system impact study, and the network upgrades are determined based on those studies.
If storage is placed at existing solar facilities that are currently online and generating, would that require the same level of transmission investment and upgrade that you've testified about?
It could, in that storage, there are going to be periods where solar capacity factors are low, i.e. rainy, cloudy days. And so if storage needs to be charged during that time, it becomes a network load, essentially. And so charging.
But by the same token, though, Mr. Roberts, thank you for that answer. But by the same token, couldn't storage also mitigate those types of low performance days for solar or wind?
It has to be evaluated. It would have to be charged by something. So if the solar is not there to charge it, something would have to charge it. And if it's not co-located, then it's got to go through the transmission distribution system to get to that load.
But if it is co-located, it can get right to that storage facility, can it?
If it's able to produce to charge the storage, that's correct.
And then if then the load, or if the power is then taken off of those battery systems, it could use the same transmission facilities that already serve the solar or wind facility, couldn't they? If it's co-located.
If it's co-located, it would have to be evaluated. We would have to perform
Okay.
a study based on our study business practices.
Would the cost of the transmission investments described in the IRP be mitigated if in fact that were true, that co-location of battery assets may reduce transmission investments?
Each resource is going to have to be evaluated on its own. Now in a serial queue, in the future, hopefully in a cluster study. And depending on what the studies reveal in that cluster study for that resource, will determine what upgrades are needed or not needed associated with interconnecting that resource. And we have very robust state interconnection procedures and federal interconnection procedures associated with that.
Certainly. But I'm not sure I understand whether you've answered my question, which is, wouldn't it seems to me, and perhaps you can confirm this, it would be self-evident that if the battery resources are located and co-located with existing solar generation, that it would use many, if not most, of the same transmission resources that are already in place. And it would therefore reduce the amount of investment necessary as described in the IRP. Is that not a fair description?
That cannot be guaranteed, because once again, if I have low capacity factor days with that solar and I need to charge that storage during that time, I'm going to have to use that transmission and distribution system to charge that storage.
Okay. When you're comparing, one of the things you do in your testimony, I believe, the charts that are on page 6 of your testimony show the various transmission costs for each of the different scenarios, the 2 base cases, and then the earliest practicable, the 70% reduction in CO2 with wind, SMR, and no new gas. Each of those, you have the transmission upgrade costs that are at least built into the analysis of the IRP. Is that right?
That is correct.
Okay. And so one thing your chart does then is help compare the various cases, one against the other, based upon what their anticipated transmission investments are, right?
Yes, it's a component of the total cost.
Of the total, right. So that would be plugged in somewhere else in the IRP to understand the total cost of each case.
Correct. It's a consideration for the total cost.
If there are other considerations between these cases which are incorrect in the IRP's analysis, for instance, if the IRP's understanding of the cost of gas between 5 and 15 years in the future is too low, that would necessarily reduce the difference in cost between the different cases, wouldn't it?
That's a question that I would defer to Witness Snyder. I mean, I can talk to transmission investment, but I can't talk to the generation investment. Okay,
that's a fair response. Thank you. I have no more questions at this time, but we do reserve the right to cross-examine on rebuttal. Thank you.
South Carolina Coastal Conservation League, Southern Alliance for Clean Energy, Sierra Club, Natural Resources Defense Council, Upstate Forever.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. No questions for Mr. Roberts on his direct from us.
And is that Attorney Kate Mixon?
I apologize. This is Attorney Goodrin Thompson for Coastal Conservation League et al. No questions for Mr. Roberts on his direct. Thank you.
Sorry about that, Attorney Thompson. So our court reporter is not familiar with the parties yet. I'm sure she will be soon, and it would help her out greatly if you would identify yourself whenever you're speaking.
Thank you for that reminder, Mr. Chairman. Apologies, Madam Court Reporter.
Yes, ma'am. It's definitely not just you. That's a general reminder. Who do we have next? Johnson Development Associates, Courtney Walsh.
Yes, Mr. Chairman. This is Court Walsh for Johnson Development. No questions on direct.
Thank you, sir. Vote Solar,
Taylor Spear for Vote Solar. Mr. Chairman, we will wait to address Mr. Roberts' rebuttal. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Office of Regulatory Staff.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is Andrew Bateman with ORS. No questions.
All right, thank you so much. Commissioners, do you have any questions for this witness? Commissioner Caston.
Just one quick question. I wanted to make sure I understood the battery question. The location of the storage, I'm assuming if this is relative to solar, that you're saying that the location wouldn't necessarily be located where the solar is, and that the solar may not be able to adequately charge, so you would have them in some location and have to distribute or transmit energy to them. Is that what all this was about?
Yes, sir. That's close. What I was intending to say, I may not have said this clearly, but if you do co-locate solar and storage, and you're intending for the solar to charge the battery, if you have low capacity factor on the solar for consecutive days, let's say, you may not have sufficient energy associated with that solar to charge the battery. And if that battery is just used periodically for a peaking function, I think that would be, the cost may not be effective. It may not be cost effective in that manner, but if that were your intention, is to use it only infrequently for peaking capacity, then maybe after 4 or 5 days, you could get enough energy of low capacity factor solar, if co-located, to charge the battery. If you're going to use it for peaking capacity, though, and you have consecutive high demand days, there's a chance you may not have enough solar to charge that storage. And if that's the case, and you need that battery for that peak day, you may have to charge it from an alternate resource. Well, that alternate resource is not going to be co-located. It's probably going to be from somewhere else, maybe miles away on the system. And so it's going to have to use the transmission and distribution system to get that energy to that battery to charge it.
Okay, that makes sense. That cleared it up for me. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Any other questions for this witness? Redirect.
Mr. Chairman.
Oh, I'm sorry, Commissioner Urban.
Thank you. I do have a couple questions for Mr. Roberts. Sir, good to have you with us today.
Good to be
I
here.
wanted to ask you, you're the transmission expert for the company, is that correct?
I'm one of many experts.
Sure. I've been reading more and more that as we integrate more solar, there's going to be a need to upgrade transmission lines and the grid. And you factored that into the integrated resource plan, I suppose?
So it's factored into those transmission investment estimates.
Okay. And have you been following President Biden's request for the spending on the infrastructure bill? He includes in his recommendations to Congress a large sum of money to upgrade transmissions. Are you familiar with that proposal?
Yes, sir. And it's subject to check, if I remember correctly, the voltage level threshold is 275 kV. And that's unfortunate. If you have a direct line to Washington, I would appreciate if you could get it down to 115 kV. But,
okay.
Because most of the upgrades are going to occur on the DP and DC system at the 100 kV, 115 kV, 230 kV level, associated with this network upgrades required to interconnect more solar.
I would encourage Duke Energy to contact our congressional delegation, particularly the United States senators in the Carolinas, because this is exactly the point I wanted to raise. We want any new monies for transmission to be cost effective and to meet the needs of our utility companies. So I hope your association and your company is reaching out and pointing out that deficiency in the current Biden plan. Do you know if that's being done?
No, sir, I do not know if that's been done within our company.
Well, I can't contact them directly. I can't contact your company directly because of an ex parte rule that prohibits us from doing so. But I'm going to ask you to take it to the top because it appears that there's a good bit of support for including transmission cost in this infrastructure package. And if we could get it in there at the appropriate level, I think it would be great because it has the benefit of holding down costs for ratepayers because that's money that they would not have to fork out in future rate increases. But it also strengthens the grid. And as you know, it takes about 10 years to do some of these transmission line installations, doesn't it? Because you have to get permits and you have to get rights of way. It's a fairly complex time construction schedule, isn't it?
Yes, Commissioner, it is. With siting, permitting, as you said, acquiring right of way, if it requires new right of way, it is time consuming. And then you have the issue of being able to schedule the outage of other transmission needed to facilitate that upgrade. And you can't, the bulk power system is like a highway system. And so can you imagine taking highway number 1, Camden or Sherrall to Camden, highway or I-95, I-20, taking both of those out at Florence, 151, taking all those highways out at once? Where would the traffic go? Especially if it's summertime, they're trying to get to the beach. That's similar to the transmission system. And so that can impede timing as well. But you're absolutely right. Siting and permitting are big factors with respect to the time it takes to get right away and basically plan for, engineer, and procure and construct a transmission line.
And to the extent you can, I'm sure you'll try to use existing rights of way, but that's not always possible, is it?
That's correct, sir.
So because we know under any scenario that we're going to have more solar and wind, and that's going to require an upgrade in transmission lines and siting, so forth. I would hope that you would be sure that your company gets involved in Washington to get it right, because it's so important to reliability, and it's also important in terms of cost. Transmission costs are not the main driver of rates, but it's a pretty big number, isn't it?
Yes, Commissioner, it is.
And so any help that we could get would be greatly appreciated. I appreciate you talking with me about it. No further questions.
All right. Any other questions for this witness? Redirect.
Mr. Chairman, Brett Bridgeford on behalf of the Duke companies, no redirect.
Please call your next witness.
Mr. Chairman, Frank Ellerby for DEC and DEP. We call Dawn Santoyani, please.
Good afternoon, Commissioners, Chairman Williams. My name is Dawn Santoyani. I'm here on behalf of the companies.
Thank you for being here, ma'am. Please raise your right hand. Do you solemnly affirm the testimony you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do so affirm.
All right. Attorney Ellaby, the floor is yours, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Santoyani, would you please state your name and would you pronounce your name correctly, please, since I don't seem to be able to, and also tell the commission what position you hold with the companies.
Sure. My name is Dawn Santoyani, Santoianni, Santoyani. I know it's a mouthful. And I am here to give some testimony on public policy and the stakeholder and policy discussions happening in North Carolina.
All right, thank you, ma'am. Did you cause to be prepared 22 pages of direct testimony that was pre-filed in these two dockets?
Yes, I did, and I have 3 exhibits that go along with that.
Let's go through. Let's get your testimony in the record, and then we'll turn to the exhibits, please. If I were to ask you the questions contained in your direct testimony today, would your answer be the same?
Yes, it would.
Okay. Mr. Chairman, we'd ask Ms. Santoyani's direct testimony be copied in the record as if given orally from the stand.
Ms. Santoyani's direct testimony will be entered into the record as if given orally from the stand.
And would you identify the 3 documents that are attached to your direct testimony as exhibits, please, ma'am?
Yes, I had 3 exhibits that were filed. The first exhibit is the Duke Energy Corporation Climate Report that was published in 2020. The second exhibit are the Duke Energy comments on the draft North Carolina Clean Energy Plan. And the third exhibit is the final North Carolina Clean Energy Plan.
Mr. Chairman, we would ask that Ms. Santoyani's 3 exhibits be admitted into the record as the next hearing exhibit, please.
Ms. Santoyani's exhibits 1, 2, and 3 will be marked and entered into the record as a composite exhibit, and that's hearing exhibit 8.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let's summarize your testimony, please. I'll walk you through it with some questions and summarize your direct testimony. So first, summarize your background in public policy relating to environmental and energy matters, please.
Sure. I have worked in energy policy and regulatory issues for over 20 years. I have a bachelor's science degree in mechanical engineering and a master's of science degree in mechanical engineering with the focus on in combustion studies. I have extensive experience with public policy, regulatory commenting, and also environmental compliance documentation. As Federal Energy Policy Director with Duke Energy, I worked on the corporation's what it was called the 2017 climate report that was published in 2018. And in my current role, I am the State Energy Policy Director for North Carolina.
Please describe your responsibilities in that current position.
In my current position, I am responsible for evaluating energy policies, engaging with stakeholders, and evaluating potential policies on how they will benefit our customers, and that's customers in DEP and DEC across both North Carolina and South Carolina. And part of that work involved, over this past year in 2020, involved engaging with stakeholders as part of the North Carolina Clean Energy Plan process.
You previously identified the exhibits. Would you elaborate, explain what your exhibits are?
Sure. The 2020 climate report to shareholders published by Duke Energy Corporation is provided to the commission as an overview. And I know it was brought up before with Witness Snyder. That is the overview of the corporation's position and lays out the climate goals as well as potential pathway to reach the corporation's climate goals. The draft clean energy plan comments that the company provided demonstrates, I provided that as evidence of how the company's approached evaluating the discussions in North Carolina about the clean energy plan goals, our raising of the different issues and that could affect our customers. And the final, likewise, that final clean energy plan was just provided as far as for the commission's consideration and knowledge on what's in that.
We usually have to fuss at other lawyers about interrupting our witnesses. I apologize that I interrupted you. Please describe the North Carolina Clean Energy Plan and explain why it is germane to this proceeding in South Carolina.
The North Carolina Clean Energy Plan established goals for the state to reduce carbon emissions 70% by 2030 and to achieve carbon neutrality by 2050. That's germane to this proceeding because many of the policies that are under discussion from that clean energy plan and the stakeholder processes that came out of that plan could affect resource planning for DEP and DEC. There are a number of different policies that carbon or climate policies that were evaluated, and those could potentially affect which resources get selected and which resources are used to serve customers. One thing I would note about that clean energy plan is that it involved a significant number of stakeholders in North Carolina. Over 160 different stakeholder groups participated. As you can imagine, each stakeholder group has a different viewpoint and diverse viewpoints.
Thank you. Do you want to elaborate a little bit further on the stakeholder process and maybe give some of the specifics about people that were involved?
Sure. So there were two different main stakeholder processes that came out of the North Carolina Clean Energy Plan. One was a carbon policy working group, and that group looked at different policies that could reduce carbon emissions in the state. The second process was what they called the North Carolina Energy Regulatory Process. And that was a stakeholder group that was looking at different regulatory reforms that could support the carbon policy, the carbon reductions, and also achieve other priorities for the state, including alternative rate making mechanisms.
Excuse me again, what are the expected outcomes of that stakeholder process in North Carolina?
So both stakeholder processes resulted in a report that was, and there were two different reports published. The outcome, it's important to recognize that those reports were basically used to inform policymakers, stakeholders that didn't participate in the process, and also inform potential future policies in North Carolina.
And would you elaborate on how the Clean Energy Plan could affect resource planning in the Carolinas for DEC and DEP?
Sure. So there are a couple of different ways that could happen. If the North Carolina Clean Energy Plan does result in some type of legislation, and let me back up 1 minute to just clarify that the Clean Energy Plan in and of itself is not, doesn't represent legislation. It would require, most of the policies that were under consideration would require enabling legislation. So if that Clean Energy Plan did result in some kind of carbon policy mandate, that would affect resource planning and DEP and DEC depending on the type of policy enacted. So certain policies that were under consideration in the North Carolina would affect planning such as a carbon price or carbon adder, they called it, in planning, could affect which resources are selected under a least cost planning scenario. Other policies may affect dispatch. For instance, one of the other policies under consideration would be for North Carolina, join a carbon market, such as the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. And if that was the case, then the price on carbon and would affect how plants are dispatched. So it would make carbon emitting resources less attractive relative to lower emitting resources. And then in comparison, obviously renewables would become more attractive in that situation. So the technological characteristics of the resources may not be changing, but to meet our regulatory obligations to meet load, there still may be some kind of carbon emitting generation on the system under those types of scenarios. Another scenario that was considered is the earliest practicable coal retirements. So that addresses an accelerated coal retirements policy and how that could, what is the earliest that coal units could be retired and what would replace them. The overall impact on planning would also be directly affected by when that carbon price or when that mandate is put into place and how that carbon price escalates over time. Another policy under consideration is a clean energy standard, which is similar to a renewable portfolio standard, only that it expands the eligibility of resources to qualify to all zero emitting resources. So if a clean energy standard or a similar policy established, for instance, targets for the percentage of sales or the mix of resources that were needed to reliably meet demand, that would also affect planning. I maybe would just sum it up to say there are numerous different policy considerations under each of these types of policies. There's different design options, and the stringency of targets would also affect how that affects resource planning. But because at this time these policies are conceptual, there's still significant uncertainty on how planning could be affected.
Could you summarize your testimony describing Duke Energy Corporation's climate goals, please?
Sure. Well, as one of the nation's largest electricity providers, Duke Energy is committed to the environment, doing its part to address climate risks and climate change, and investing in resilient infrastructure to deliver cleaner energy to our customers across the Carolinas and our other jurisdictions. Through 2019, Duke Energy had already reduced carbon emissions by nearly 40% since 2005. And that, as you've heard from other witnesses, was a result of retiring coal units and replacing them with natural gas and renewables. As we've seen sustained low natural gas prices and renewables costs declining, that's allowed Duke Energy to accelerate our climate goals in terms of looking at the Duke Energy climate report laid out new goals of 50% carbon reduction fleet-wide by 2030 and a net zero target by 2050. Importantly, those goals were based on, the 2030 goal was based on the technologies that exist today and could be leveraged and are commercially available today, whereas the 2050 goal and the climate report recognize the need for dispatchable zero emitting resources to meet that net zero goal. That climate report also included a illustrative pathway to that net zero emissions. And as I mentioned, it charted that need for the low carbon, the zero emitting load following resources. We worked extensively with stakeholders throughout this IRP, obviously, these IRPs, but also we would continue to work with stakeholders as we chart the specific course to how the corporation would meet its 2030 and 2050 goals.
Are both the North Carolina Clean Energy Plan and Duke Energy Corporation's climate goals considered in the IRPs filed by DEC and DEP?
Yes, they are considered, and we were responsive to requests from stakeholders and policymakers by including those portfolios that accelerated coal retirements, and also the two 70% reduction by 2030 portfolios addressed the clean energy plan goals, and the no new gas portfolio was also to address interest from stakeholders who wanted to understand what not building new gas resources would look like in terms of what that would mean for coal retirements and emissions reductions.
Mr. Chairman, Taylor Spear for Vote Solar.
Yes, sir.
I move to strike the last testimony on grounds of an objection that Duke Energy raised in discovery, that they objected to providing that information to us. Now they're saying something inconsistent with that objection. That's a sword and shield doctrine. You can't rely on a discovery objection and then come into trial and say something different. That's inconsistent with the discovery answers that we've seen. I move to strike the testimony.
Mr. Chairman, that's the subject for cross-examination. If Mr. Spear wants to cross-examine the witness on discovery responses, he's free to do that. We're summarizing her testimony. That testimony is already in the record. She's simply summarizing it now. It's too late to be moving to strike something that's already in the record.
That's a legal argument, Mr. Chairman. That is not proper for cross.
Well, is it not true that we entered her direct testimony into the record about 20 minutes ago?
I was not expecting to hear that Duke Energy incorporated the climate report into their IRP. That's inconsistent with discovery responses and what Mr. Schneider has told the commission. If I need to address it on cross, I can do that. I'm relying on a legal argument here, sword and shield. You can't tell somebody in discovery that we object because there's no relation to the two. That discovery response says very specifically it's irrelevant and not likely to lead to admissible evidence because it wasn't considered. We're in a position now of being having deprived discovery, which is something that we find out now in the hearing is highly relevant.
I'll give you a chance to respond.
Briefly, this is summary of the testimony, and maybe the wording was slightly different. That's got Mr. Spear excited, but what we've offered in the summary is that the clean energy plan and the climate goals of the corporation were considered in the IRPs. And that's her testimony. That was in her direct testimony. That's in the record. He's free to cross-examine about that, but there's not a basis for striking the testimony.
In fairness, Mr. Chairman, I would just ask Mr. Ellerby to instruct counsel where exactly that exists in the direct testimony. That those two things that was considered. This is news to me.
I would like to see that too, Mr. Attorney Ellerby.
And if it helps the commission, happy to pull up that discovery response again. It's very particular in its wording. It leaves little room, little doubt.
All right, please pull it up or get it ready. Cue it up. Mr. Ellerby, could you point out the witness's testimony and her direct testimony? Her summary, what she just summarized. Could you point that out in her direct testimony that we entered into the record?
Page 16, the question is, are both the North Carolina Clean Energy Plan and Duke Energy Corporation's climate goals considered in the IRPs filed by DEC and DEP? The answer, yes. And then goes on to give an answer that's very similar to what her summary said.
Attorney Spear?
I will be pulling up this interrogatory. Sorry, it's not an interrogatory; it's a discovery response. But there's a lot of inconsistency here. Mr. Chairman, permission to share my screen?
Please do.
This is the question. Has the company conducted an assessment of climate risk on the assets, operations, and earnings of Duke Energy Carolinas and Duke Energy Progress specifically? Response. DEC and DEP object to this request because the Duke Energy 2020 climate report was not used in any way in the development of the 2020 IRPs, and therefore the request seeks information that is not relevant, not likely to lead to discovery of admissible evidence in this IRP proceeding. This is classic sword and shield. They're hiding the ball, and they come into the hearing and they say something different.
Attorney Ellaby?
Mr. Chairman, this is what Mr. Snyder talked about earlier. We went over this same ground earlier this morning. This is the plan, the goals contained in the plan were considered as part of the IRP process. That's not different from what's stated in that discovery response.
Well, I guess the question is, was the 2020 climate report used in the IRP or not?
It says the question we asked and what our witness testified to was that both of those goals.
Attorney Ellaby, I hate to interrupt you, but Attorney Spear, if you could unshare your screen. Attorney Ellaby, please proceed.
The climate goals contained in the Clean Energy Plan and the climate goal and the company's climate goals are considered in the IRPs. The same goals, the same effort to reduce carbon. So I think this is classic material for cross-examination by Mr. Spear. It's certainly not a basis for striking testimony that's already in the record and was admitted with no objection.
We have been deprived discovery on an important issue, and this is codified discovery. Act 62 permits parties discovery on these issues. When a lawyer sees this language, because the Duke Energy 2020 climate report was not used in any way in the development of the 2020 IRPs, that concludes the issue.
When a lawyer reads the direct testimony that's pre-filed in the case and thinks there's a discrepancy, the lawyer makes a motion to compel, Mr. Spear. It doesn't wait for the hearing to engage in a discovery dispute.
I didn't need to make a motion to compel. This says what it says. This says exactly what I needed it to say. Now I'm hearing something different. I didn't need to file a motion to compel.
But you had the testimony. I don't want to argue with you, Mr. Chairman. I apologize, but this testimony was filed months ago.
And my apologies.
Understood. Look, I appreciate South Carolina's version of court TV, but let's do this. Your objection is noted for the record. We'll rule on it in the final order. Make sure you're included in your post-hearing briefs. Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Ellaby, I apologize. I shouldn't have spoken to you directly.
Ms. Santorani, please summarize the key features of the IRPs that are dependent upon future changes in law or regulation in general.
As regulated utilities, DEP and DEC are obligated to develop IRPs based on the policies in effect at the time. Consistent with Act 62 and North Carolina requirements, the IRPs include a base case without carbon policy portfolio that represents the resource adequacy and capacity to serve anticipated peak electrical load with applicable planning reserve margins, consumer affordability, at least cost, compliance with applicable state and federal environmental regulations, and power supply reliability, commodity price risks, diversity of generation supply. So to show the potential impact of new policies that may have on future resource additions, the 2020 IRPs also included portfolios with more ambitious carbon reduction targets, but would require enabling policy. We've discussed that, the other witnesses have discussed that in terms of the Harvey Ball in the IRP, reflecting some needed policy to enact. So this is important. Specifically, we believe that all these portfolios, except the base without carbon policy, would require enabling policy changes. That policy could take numerous forms, including a direct mandate to reduce carbon emissions by a specific percentage, by a certain year, a policy that would mandate consideration of carbon emissions in planning, like a carbon adder or shadow pricing on carbon, or in dispatch, mandating coal retirements policy, participation in a carbon market, or a plan that would affect which resources qualify with compliance, say under a clean energy standard. The one thing all of those policies have in common is that it would mandate changes that are not least cost. And although all of the policies may not directly affect resource planning, in addition to reducing emissions, these policies could have associated benefits, including job creation, economic development, mitigation of other future risks. However, we believe the consideration of these impacts is beyond the scope of the IRPs and the IRP process.
How has affordability and impacts on customer bills been considered in the North Carolina Clean Energy Plan process?
Yes, it has. It's been considered both quantitatively and qualitatively.
Have the interests of the DEC and DEP customers in South Carolina been taken into consideration in the efforts you have described to adopt the North Carolina Clean Energy Plan?
Yes, it has. And that's because Duke Energy has repeatedly raised, because we operate our system across North Carolina and South Carolina, both DEP and DEC systems. We are aware that policies enacted in one state can affect customers in another state. And we have repeatedly raised this issue during the North Carolina Clean Energy Plan process, and to make sure that other stakeholders understood that perspective. As we analyze policies, we also look at how the policy would affect resource planning, dispatch, or both. So it's useful to compare policies to each other, determine which policy is more cost-effective than another, and how those costs may increase or decrease over time, whether the policy has the potential to introduce price shocks for customers or abrupt changes in compliance costs, and whether there are cost mitigation measures that could be introduced through policy design or implementation. And there's a number of different ways that can happen. That's why we feel it's important for Duke Energy, and particularly the companies in this case, to participate in the North Carolina Clean Energy Plan, stakeholder processes, and these types of policy discussions.
Thank you, ma'am. Does that conclude your summary of your direct testimony?
That concludes my summary today. I thank the Commission very much for the opportunity to appear.
Well, you're not finished. I'm going to turn you over now for cross-examination or questions from the commissioners. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Attorney Ellaby. I anticipate that this cross-examination will be lengthy. So before we go down that road, let's take a 15-minute break. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to the Public Service Commission of South Carolina. We're here in dockets number 2019-264E and 2019-265. 224? Oh, goodness. I've been all right. Right. So we're here in 2019-224 and 2019-225. Let's take roll. Here in the hearing room, we have Commissioner Caston, Vice Chair Belzer, Chairman Williams. Joining us virtually, we have Commissioners Irvin, Thomas, and Powers. We are at cross-examination for the company's witness. We will start with Carolina's Clean Energy Business Association. Carolina Clean Energy.
Mr. Chairman, Ben Snowden for CC, but we do not have any questions for this witness. Thank you.
All right. South Carolina Coastal Conservation League, Southern Alliance for Clean Energy, Sierra Club, Natural Resources, Defense Council, Upstate Forever.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Goodrin Thompson on behalf of those groups. I do have a few questions for Ms. Santoyani.
Please proceed, ma'am. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Ms. Santoyani. Just a few quick questions for you. You say, and this is on page 16 of your direct testimony, lines 20 to 21, if you want to take a moment to get there, although I don't think it'll be.
I'm there.
You say that DEC and DEP are obligated to develop IRPs based on the policies in effect at that time or at the time, correct?
Correct.
And you go on to mention Act 62 and North Carolina requirements. You're not a lawyer, I believe, so you're not purporting to render a legal opinion there, are you?
That's correct. That I am not a lawyer, and that is just my understanding of those requirements.
Okay. And then, so I recognize you don't have a crystal ball, none of us do, but in light of your extensive experience in state and federal policy over the years, in your professional opinion, do you believe that carbon regulation in some form, whether at the state or at the federal level, will come into effect during the 15-year IRP planning horizon?
I think it's possible, and the portfolios that the companies presented in the IRPs, because we don't know the form, we presented those various portfolios to kind of capture some range of possibilities as to what that could look like.
And if North Carolina were to enact a carbon policy as an outcome of the Clean Energy Plan process or some other process, but South Carolina does not enact any carbon policy, the costs of complying with that North Carolina policy would be recovered from North Carolina ratepayers, correct?
So I am not involved in the regulatory proceedings for the rate cases and would probably have to defer to another witness. But if it was an environmental compliance cost, then it would presumably be a cost and it would depend on what the form of that policy is and how it affected the costs for the resource, for generating electricity for our customers across the Carolinas. So I think there's a lot of unknowns there as far as how that would affect the customers across the jurisdictions. But if it was an environmental compliance cost, then it would be typically it would be costs incurred that would be used to serve our customers.
Okay, so I understand that you're not a rate-making expert, and this might be outside your wheelhouse, but does it sound right to you that if there is a state-specific environmental law, as in your position as somebody who's worked on both state and federal policy, that the cost of complying with that law would be recovered from the customers in that state and not from the customers across the entire system?
Objection, Mr. Chairman. The witness just said that that was not in her area and she doesn't know the answer to that question. And to go back and ask her to now give an answer to the same question is inappropriate. So I object.
Fair enough. Fair enough. I'll withdraw the question. Mr. Chairman, if I might ask Mr. Ellerby to offer perhaps if there's another witness who would be the more appropriate witness to ask that question. I believe that companies, certainly put this in issue by including discussion of the impact of any North Carolina policies on South Carolina customers in her direct testimony.
That's a legal question, Mr. Chairman, that is exceedingly complex. And as the witness said, it's going to depend on so many factors. We don't have a witness who has a crystal ball that can tell this commission what would happen with regard to the rate-making implications. The company is advocating, as the witness has explained, to try to protect customers, but we don't know how it would be allocated on a system basis or direct basis at this time.
Mr. Chairman, I've withdrawn my question. Thank you. And that's all I have. Thank you, Ms. Santoyani.
Johnson Development Associates.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, this is Court Walsh for Johnson Development. We don't have any questions.
Vote Solar.
Mr. Chairman, Taylor Spear for Vote Solar. May I proceed?
Yes, sir.
Am I pronouncing your name correctly, Santoyani?
Santoyani, that's correct.
Okay, thank you. I want to talk about some of your direct testimony. I'm beginning on page 19 and beginning at line 10. You're asked the question, how has the investment community reacted to these matters? And do you have a copy of your direct testimony?
I do. I have it in front of me.
Okay, are you at that question?
I am.
Thank you. I posed this question to Mr. Schneider, and I believe an objection was sustained on it. So I'm going to ask you if you have any sort of expertise in this area, but would you agree with the comment that Duke Energy's attention to or investment in addressing climate change risks affects the enterprise's valuation?
As I state in my testimony, my direct testimony, it is addressing climate risks from the corporate level has been of interest to investors. And so that could affect the valuation if investors felt that risks were not being appropriately addressed. That is one of the reasons that Duke Energy had also has our climate goals to be able to address these risks.
And when you say climate goals, would you also be referring to the 2020 climate report?
Well, the climate report stated the goals. And so I just want to be clear that there's the climate goals of the enterprise. The climate report addressed what the company thinks it needs to do to address climate risks more holistically. And the climate goals were one component of that. The carbon reduction goals were one component of that. But the goals are an enterprise-wide goal.
Is it fair to say that one of the purposes of developing and authoring the climate report was to maintain or increase the company's valuation?
One of the purposes of publishing the climate report was to be very transparent with investors on how the company was approaching this issue.
Okay, and I think this is self-evident, but I want to make sure that I have a clear record. Transparency to your shareholders increases the corporation's valuation, correct? It doesn't decrease it.
I am not a financial expert, so that seems a little bit outside of my wheelhouse, but the general trend from investors has been to understand what the company is doing to address climate change.
You agree that you discuss valuation a number of times in your direct testimony, do you not?
Yes, I address how investors are looking at our involvement in the North Carolina Clean Energy Plan process, and also the long-term vision for achieving climate goals.
Okay, and but you're not able to tell me whether or not transparency on Duke Energy's addressing of climate change risk increases or decreases shareholder value?
I would say investors react positively to transparency. So by that token, it would make sense that that could increase valuation.
Thank you. And I want to similarly address the same issue with respect to Duke Energy's handling of climate change risk. Showing investors that you are handling climate change risk increases valuation, correct?
Again, I think there's a number of factors on valuation. And so my testimony was just meant to indicate, my direct testimony was to state that this investors are looking for information on how climate risk is being addressed. And Duke Energy Corporation has responded to that by publishing a climate report and has also set climate goals to address these risks.
But you would agree that one of those factors, you addressed many, and I think that's a perfectly fair point. I appreciate you saying that, but certainly one of those factors is a positive return from Duke Energy showing its investors that it is considering and attempting to address climate change risk, correct?
I think it gets down to what the cost of capital is. As the Duke Energy's credit rating is important for providing having cost-effective access to capital, which benefits our customers.
Please tell the commission the connection between addressing climate change risk and Duke Energy's cost of capital.
Addressing climate change risk, as I stated in my testimony, we see investors looking at climate risk as one of the factors that they will look for as far as whether to invest in companies. And so I mentioned that both S&P and Moody's integrate ESG or environment, sustainability, governance factors into their risk assessments and rating methodologies.
Please tell the commission what the ESG is and how that affects valuation.
ESG is the term for environment, sustainability, and governance, which is a lot of investors are now looking at companies' performance on those metrics to see whether they consider them to be worthy of investment.
Are you aware of BlackRock's position as a major shareholder of Duke Energy on climate change and the utility addressing those risks?
I am aware that BlackRock is one of the investors that has been interested in climate risk and has engaged with companies on those risks.
And they're active in publishing their view that the financial risks proposed by climate change could create a sea change for financial markets in the energy sector, correct?
I'm not familiar with that exact quote, but that's aligned with what I understand their position is. They have been, we engage with all of our investors in a very transparent manner, and BlackRock has been that engagement has been very positive, and there have not been, we would expect that if there were specific issues with how they thought we were addressing climate risk, that they would bring that up with us.
Well, they have brought, I mean, I'm just asking you, because I don't know, but wouldn't they bring that up with you and they're voting with their shares? Haven't they done that? Haven't they spoken in that way?
They have not voted against our board. Last year, they did not vote against our board on anything, to my understanding.
Okay. You say that companies with favorable ESG reputations have been rewarded by the market and outperformed sector peers. What you're saying there, isn't it, that if a public utility is paying attention to climate change risks, they're rewarded in their shareholder value, right?
Yes, as with other types of, there's been, as with many investors being interested in ESG metrics, that opens up favorable ESG reputations actually help a company in terms of like I said, the access to capital and the investment.
Finally, you state for an electric utility company, greenhouse gas emissions are considered a material ESG that impacts valuation. What does that mean, please?
So material ESG issue would be one that we report on our SEC disclosures. And so we report that it's material to have the financial impact to the company.
Okay, I'd like to direct your attention to some of the things that Mr. Snyder said. And were you present while Mr. Snyder testified?
Yes, I did listen to his testimony.
And you heard him say that the 2020 climate change report prepared by Duke Energy was not considered for purposes of the IRP, correct?
That's correct. And I'm not sure what my answer earlier during direct was, but the point about having corporate climate goals, that was, and that the CEP process, our IRP, informed that the CEP, our IRPs were addressing some of the issues that came out in the Clean Energy Plan process, and that it's also aligned with our climate goals. That was the point of my testimony.
Okay, and is that vis-a-vis providing the commission with a base case with a carbon policy exclusively?
Well, there's multiple portfolios in the IRP that address a range of carbon policy scenarios. And as I said during my direct, these carbon policies could take many forms. So the IRP portfolios, the various IRP portfolios then address different decarbonization rates or targets. And they, in that sense, that they are addressing some of the issues and policies that are being discussed in North Carolina.
When you say rates, are you referring to the annual reduction of greenhouse gases? Because, I mean, as I understand it, there's two targets. You've got one at 230 and one at 250. So are you looking at that more on a granular level?
No, rates was probably the wrong choice of word there, but it was targets.
Okay, but there's only two targets. I want to make sure I understand your testimony. There's only two targets, right? 2030 and 2050.
Which targets are you referring to? The North Carolina Clean Energy Plan targets?
Okay, maybe that's the where we're not hooking up here. For targets, you're referring to North Carolina Clean Energy Plan.
In which statement? So we can be abundantly clear.
Okay, I'm curious what you meant by targets.
In the statement I just made right now.
Yes, ma'am.
So the targets of the North Carolina Clean Energy Plan and, right, the 2030 target in the North Carolina Clean Energy Plan is what I was referring to.
Okay, I'm going to pull up, and I apologize, Mr. Chairman. I will do better at keeping a running list of admitted exhibits, but I'm going to reference this as Vote Solar Cross Exhibit 7. I hope that's acceptable. So I'll pull that up.
It's hearing exhibit 4, Attorney Spear.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll refer to it as hearing exhibit 4. Ms. Santoyani, I'm going to share my screen with you. I'm going to show you hearing exhibit 4. Okay, we're going to go through this briefly. I'm not intending to belabor this, but you've seen this. You heard Mr. Schneider testify on it, correct?
Yes.
Okay, and then the question A, has the company conducted an assessment of climate risk on the assets, operations, and earnings of Duke Energy Carolinas and/or Duke Energy Progress specifically? Response: the Duke Energy 2020 climate report was not used in any way in the development of the 2020 IRPs. How do you square that with the summary that you've just outlaid in your direct testimony?
So I think when the climate report was not used in any way in the development of the 2020 IRPs, is the question was whether there was DEP and DEC specific assessments on the climate risk of the assets, operations, or earnings. The Duke Energy climate report was not, the inputs of the climate report were not used in the IRPs. The IRPs are aligned with the Duke Energy climate goals, which is what my testimony refers to, and it also addresses some of the policies that are being discussed in the North Carolina Clean Energy Plan.
When you say goals, are you referring to achieving a 2030 target and achieving a 2050 target?
It was, yeah, the Duke Energy Corporation's goals of 50% by 2030 and net zero by 2050. The IRPs are aligned with that, but they did not use inputs from that climate report. There was no assessment that was conducted in that climate report that was used in the IRPs.
I hear your focus on imports, and I appreciate that. I also want to make sure that any sort of insights or exports from the Climate 2050 report were not incorporated into the 2020 IRPs presented in this proceeding. Is that a correct statement?
That's a correct statement.
Okay. I'm going to give you an opportunity to look at this hearing exhibit 4. And I want to open it up to you and ask you, do you have any opinion that is different or inconsistent with what's contained in Duke's answers in this discovery response?
No, I don't have any, the discovery response looks correct to me.
You don't dispute any information in hearing exhibit 4?
I don't dispute the information in the response.
Okay. 1 second, Mr. Chairman. Screen sharing. We will conclude the questioning. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Office of Regulatory Staff.
No questions, Mr. Chairman. This is Andrew Bateman with ORS. Thank you.
Commissioner questions.
Chairman Williams.
Commissioner Caston.
Wait a minute, I got to make sure I get the name right here. Santoyani.
Santoyani.
Ani. I'm sorry. I really practiced it and messed it up.
That's okay.
And I'm going to date myself with this, but when I was in school at Clemson some time back, we had an engineering economic analysis class. And during, the focus then was looking at present value, future value, and those things, and benefit cost primarily. As a matter of fact, I was thinking about it during all this discussion, is that was about the time when all the talk was about global cooling. It really was, which is rather ironic. So 40 years from now, who knows what we'll be talking about. But as I was listening to discussion, thinking about it, whether the markets reward this, I assume from an investment point of view and from a lending point of view. Is that what you're saying? Preferred rates from a lending point of view and more investors from the equity point of view?
Yes, the intent of my direct testimony and my statements today were to indicate that this is looking at climate risks and the transparency in looking at those risks is something that investors are paying attention to. And reducing carbon is very important to many investors. Obviously, there's lots of different types of investors, but many of them are interested in reducing emissions and mitigating those risks.
Well, I guess
and that does, sorry to interrupt you, that does directly lead to the credit rating of the company over time, among other factors.
One of the many factors you're saying, not the factor.
Yes. It is not the factor, correct.
Okay. Because as I think about these things, so far everything I've seen, at least in the testimony and things I've read from at least Duke's perspective, is that, a carbon tax will, from a transmission and everything else, boost costs significantly. Whether that's accurate or not, I can't say. That's just what I'm seeing. All these things considered, the one thought that keeps going through my mind is regardless of what investors like or don't like, or these costs, if they are higher, will be passed on to the customer, the consuming public. Is that correct?
It's like a cost of carbon, like a carbon price. Is that what you're referring to?
Whatever additional cost we have from policies occurring or developed.
Right, yes, those costs increase the cost of producing electricity, which increase the cost to customers.
That's all I have. Thank you right now. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Any other questions for this witness? Redirect.
Mr. Chairman, we have no redirect of this witness.
Thank you, sir. Please call your next witness.
Mr. Chairman.
Commissioner Urban.
I did have a couple of questions for the witness, if I can, if you don't mind.
All right.
Thank you, sir. It's good to have you with us today. I appreciate your testimony. I wanted to get your thoughts in terms of future planning and trying to meet the goals that Duke Energy has set in terms of reducing the carbon footprint. Would you agree that one way would be to leverage demand-side solutions at scale? And what I mean by that, historically we built and run an electric grid by forecasting customer demand for electricity and then building and dispatching central energy generating assets to meet the peak demand. Don't you think it's time to actively engage at scale the flexibility that customers would be willing to bring to the table? Like controllable thermostats and things like that?
Yes, I believe that can, sorry, I'm getting a little bit of feedback. Those technologies can help with reducing costs to the extent that they are practicable. And I would believe witness back for the companies could speak a little bit more to that, as that's his area of expertise.
Yes. And don't you think that investing in advanced forecasting, modeling, and planning capabilities would also help with the rapid increase in clean energy resources like wind and solar, the need for better forecasting to, for example, climate, weather, behavioral aspects that can be clearly understood with, all the new artificial intelligence and capabilities and weather forecasting that's available. Don't you think that could play a part?
Well, I will defer to some of our other witnesses that are in better position, but what I could say at a high level is that we are consistently seeking the best tools to do this analysis. And so perhaps one of the other witnesses can more specifically address that, though.
Do you know whether Duke Energy is using IBM weather forecasting?
I do not know the answer to that, Commissioner.
All right. Are they using machine learning simulations to assess renewables? Like, the National Renewable Energy Laboratory is doing that now. They're pushing it out as a way to increase reliability, predictability.
Again, Commissioner, I would defer to the other witnesses that have the technical knowledge about the modeling tools. My area of expertise is in the policy arena.
Okay. Since this is a policy question, I think we need to kind of adjust rates and pricing from that paradigm shift from the traditional regulated model to more adaptive models for pricing energy. Would you agree that that's something we need to consider?
I can say that that is something that alternative rate-making models is being considered in North Carolina as part of that clean energy plan stakeholder process, and how that, and that's being looked at through the lens of how that supports decarbonization efforts.
Right, like time of use programs to send out price signals to customers so they can save money by participating in those type programs.
In North Carolina, it's not under that clean energy plan. It wasn't, there was, as far as the carbon policy work there and the other stakeholder process on the energy regulatory process, there wasn't specific work done on looking at customer programs, but it was recognized that customer programs play a role.
Okay. And I do want to thank you and the company for reaching out and engaging stakeholders. I think that's to be commended, and I hope you'll continue to do that in both Carolinas. Thank you for your testimony today.
Thank you, Commissioner.
All right, if there are no further questions for this witness, ma'am, you can step down, and applicant, you can call your next witness.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The companies will now call Mr. Brian Bach to the stand.
All right, Mr. Bach, if you would, take the stand.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman.
Good afternoon, sir. Hope you're doing well. Please raise your right hand. Do you affirm to tell the truth? Excuse me. Do you affirm that the testimony that you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Thank you, sir. Please proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Bach, would you please state your name for the record?
Sure. My name is Brian Bach.
And by whom are you employed and in what capacity?
I'm employed by Duke Energy Business Services, LLC, as a manager of DSM Analytics.
And did you prepare or cause to be prepared 17 pages of direct testimony that were pre-filed with the commission in this proceeding?
Yes.
If I asked you the same questions that were contained within your pre-filed direct testimony this afternoon, would your answers be the same?
Yes, they would.
Mr. Chairman, at this time, I would ask that Mr. Bach's pre-filed direct testimony be entered into the record as if given orally from the stand.
Mr. Bach's pre-filed direct testimony will be entered into the record as if given orally from the stand.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Bach, did you also prepare or cause to be prepared 2 exhibits that were attached to your pre-filed direct testimony?
Yes, I did.
And do you have any changes to those exhibits at this time?
I do not.
Mr. Chairman, I would ask that those 2 pre-filed direct exhibits belonging to Mr. Bach be entered into the record as the next hearing exhibit.
Mr. Bach's 2 exhibits will be marked as a composite exhibit and entered into the record as hearing Exhibit 9.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We'll now present a brief summary of Mr. Bach's pre-filed direct testimony in question and answer format. Mr. Bach, as manager DSM Analytics for the companies, what are you responsible for?
I have the primary responsibility for forecasting and analysis of energy efficiency programs, also known as EE, across all the Duke Energy jurisdictions. This also includes contracting with third-party vendors to conduct market potential studies of energy efficiency and demand-side management, also referred to as DSM. Also the development of EE forecasts utilizing integrated resource plans as well as long-term fuel procurement planning. And I'm also responsible for coordination with Duke Energy's EE and DSM program managers to develop content for the IRP documents, what you see in the appendices of the IRPs, as well as collaboration with Duke Energy's Integrated Systems and Operation Planning team, or ISOP team, on issues relating to EE and DSM.
Thank you. And what's your background in these matters?
I was previously employed by Exelon Corporation, working in financial planning and analysis, primarily focusing on long-range financial planning, evaluation of key drivers of the company's financial forecasts. Also was employed for 3 years as manager of strategic planning with Emerson Electric Corporation, and I've been with Duke Energy since 2014. Initially, I was in the integrated resource planning team for the Midwestern jurisdictions before joining the newly formed ISOP team, and then now working with EE and DSM.
And what is the purpose of your direct testimony in these proceedings?
Purpose of my testimony is just to provide an overview of the company's current suite of DSM and EE programs that were considered in formulating DEC and DEP's IRPs. Also how the company and that the companies believe that the EE DSM analysis that we use in these IRPs does meet the requirements of Act 62.
And what are energy efficiency and demand side management programs?
Energy efficiency programs are those that improve the energy efficiency of customers to the end of reducing their electricity consumption. So for IRP purposes, the resulting EE-based demand and energy savings are treated as a reduction to the load forecast, which then also serves to reduce the associated need to build new supply-side generation, as well as transmission distribution facilities. DSM programs, also sometimes referred to as demand response, I believe I heard that earlier today. Programs that are either automatically or through some other communications means they prompt customers to reduce electricity use during select peak hours as selected by the company or specified by the company. The IRPs tend to treat these dispatchable types of DSM programs as resource options that can be dispatched in lieu of additional traditional generating assets to meet system capacity during needs of peak demand.
Thank you. And where are the list of EE DSM programs that are currently offered by the companies?
The current suite of EE DSM programs that are listed and described in Appendix D to each of the IRPs. Lists of the programs were filed as Bach Direct Exhibit 1, which was just entered. Potential new programs and measures and potential modifications to these existing programs and measures are presented and reviewed with the EE DSM Collaborative prior to being submitted to the Commission for approval.
Thank you. We just talked briefly about the collaborative or collaboration in general. What is the EEDSM collaborative?
The EEDSM collaborative specifically, it's an advisory group of interested stakeholders who provide insight and input to DEC and DEP as related to EE and DSM programs. So the company seeks and considers input from the collaborative for new programs and measures, for modifications to existing programs and energy saving measures.
And who are members of that EEDSM collaborative group, or who contributes to those discussions?
Collaborative is actually a large group of members, which are listed in my direct testimony, but include many of the interveners to these IRP proceedings.
You mentioned program cost effectiveness. How do the companies evaluate whether an EEDSM program is cost effective or not?
The companies evaluate cost effectiveness of EEDSM programs from a variety of perspectives using widely accepted cost effectiveness tests. The commission authorized use of the UCT or utility cost test in January 2021 for the purposes of evaluating programs to be offered to the company's customers.
And what have the companies done to evaluate the potential impact of EEDSM programs on energy savings?
In 2019, the companies commissioned an EEDSM market potential study to obtain estimates of the technical, economic, and achievable savings potential for EE and DSM within the DEC and DEP service territories. The final report was prepared by our vendor, Nexon Incorporated. It completed the final report initially in May of 2020 and then did a final revision to that report in June 2020 prior to the IRP filings.
And how did the companies receive or react to the market potential studies? Were they?
The companies found the market potential studies to be a reasonable assessment of the market potential for future energy savings, and the companies utilized and relied on those forecasts in development of their IRPs.
And so tell us more, how did the companies utilize the market potential studies as related to the IRPs? The company has good visibility as to the near term of what we anticipate for our energy forecast. So the savings that were contained in the IRPs, we took a blended projection of the company's 5-year program planning forecast and then combined that with the long-term achievable potential projections from the market potential study. Thank you. And how were the EE programs evaluated using the market potential studies?
Using the market potential study, the company prepared 3 sets of projections consistent with Act 62. We had a base or medium EE portfolio savings projection, which was based on the company's current 5-year program plan for 2020 through 2024. That was then blended together with the base scenario from the market potential study for years 2025 through 2035. We also had a high EE portfolio with savings projections that were based on an adjusted 5-year program plan, which was increased somewhat for 2020 to 2024, and then blended with we had as the enhanced and avoided energy cost sensitivity scenarios from the market potential study for years 2025 through 2035. And then finally, we had a low EE portfolio savings projection, which was developed by applying just a reduction factor across all measures in the base EE portfolio as a way to forecast a lower than expected adoption of all measures. And this methodology is described on pages 35 and 36 of both the DEC and DEP IRPs.
Thank you. And how were the demand side management programs evaluated as part of the market potential studies?
For development of DSM portion of the market potential studies, the participation rate was determined by the incentive levels and marketing inputs for each DSM scenario, assuming that incentives are uniform across all customer segments within a given customer class. So for the base scenario, Nexit assumed the existing incentives for DSM programs would continue to be used, similar to what we use today. They did also an enhanced scenario where they took the existing incentive levels for each program and doubled those. And then those resulting projections of achievable DSM potential were used to inform the development of DSM forecasts for the IRP.
Thank you, Mr. Bach. And Mr. Chairman, Mr. Bach will be available for questions from council and the commission now. And just as a reminder, he'll also be presenting his rebuttal testimony later on during this hearing. Thank you, Mr. Bach.
All right, Carolina Clean Energy Business Association.
This is Ben Snowden for CC, but Mr. Chairman, we do not have any questions for Mr. Bach on his direct.
South Carolina Coastal Conservation League, Southern Alliance for Clean Energy, Sierra Club, Natural Resources Defense Council, Upstate Forever.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, this is Kate Mixon, and we do have some questions for Mr. Bach.
All right, please proceed, Attorney Mixon.
Thank you. Hi, Mr. Bach. The companies engaged a consultant, Nexant, to prepare market potential studies for the Duke companies in 2019. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And am I correct that the purpose of those studies was to estimate the technical, economic, and achievable potential for EE savings or EE and DSM savings within the company's service areas over a 25-year period?
That's correct.
And as you, I think, testified a moment ago, those studies forecast potential under 3 scenarios. A base scenario, an enhanced scenario, which consider the impact of increased program spending, and an avoided energy cost sensitivity where higher future energy prices result in increased economic and achievable energy efficiency savings potential. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Thank you. And then the companies used those three scenarios from the market potential studies to develop their low base and high DSM cases in the IRP. Isn't that correct?
That's correct.
So then kind of going a little further into how these fit in. So as you state on page 5, lines 10 through 13 of your direct testimony, Duke then used those resulting energy efficiency based band and energy savings as a reduction to the load forecast in the IRPs. Is that correct?
That's correct.
So turning back to the market potential studies themselves, Nexant used a cost effectiveness screening test called the total resource cost test to identify achievable potential. Isn't that correct?
That's correct.
Would you agree that the total resource cost test, or TRC, is intended to look at costs and benefits to both the utility and participants?
I mean, the total resource cost test, I mean, it does look at the, like you said, the total system benefits to the utility as well as the customer, along with the total cost of implementation. So that would encompass all costs associated with implementing that program or putting that measure in place. So it would, in the case of a customer, the cost of them purchasing and installing that equipment or any incentive that the utility provided to assist them in that.
Right. Thank you, Mr. Bach. So I guess just to make sure it's very clear on the record, so the TRC does include costs to participants, not just costs to the utility. Is that right?
There's a separate test, the participant cost test, which measures that more directly, but it does capture the costs of the equipment, which would be a participant cost in the case of, say, like an HVAC program where we're providing a rebate for a higher efficiency air conditioner. It would cap, the TRC test would capture the cost of that equipment to the customer.
Thank you. But the total resource cost test, that doesn't include all of the benefits that a participant might enjoy from participating in a program, like, for instance, health benefits or fuel or water savings. Is that correct?
Correct. It does not include what generally a group is referred to as non-energy benefits. Correct. It does not account for those directly.
And are you aware that energy efficiency organizations, including the American Council for an Energy Efficient Economy, have found that the TRC test can be an asymmetrical test because that I guess ultimately underestimates cost effectiveness, or can underestimate cost effectiveness, because it counts a number of categories of costs to customers without their attendant benefits, such as health benefits, fuel, or water savings, as I mentioned before.
Sure. Yeah, I have heard the test referred to in that manner, and that is one of the, I think, drivers why there has been an interest in moving towards the utility cost test, which is what was approved then by the commission for use beginning in January of 2021.
Great, thank you, Mr. Bach. And so I guess talking a little bit more about the utility cost test, the UCT, that compares the cost for the utility to, for instance, provide incentives or the cost of administering a program against the avoided cost benefits of energy efficiency. Is that right?
That's correct.
And so in other words, it looks at whether a DSM EE program or portfolio would save the utility more money than it costs the utility.
Correct.
When the companies are comparing the costs of different portfolios in their IRPs, they're looking at the net present value of revenue requirements of each portfolio under various scenarios. Isn't that correct?
That's correct.
And in layman's terms, that also means the costs to the utility, right?
The revenue requirements would be, I mean, it's the utility cost, but also it ultimately becomes the cost to customers as a whole.
Nexan, at Duke's request, did conduct a sensitivity analysis where they identified economic potential using the utility cost test. Isn't that correct?
That's correct.
And do you recall that the results of that UCT analysis for DEC showed an increase in economic potential of 74%, 49%, and 11% for residential, commercial, and industrial sectors as compared with the TRC results?
Yes, the UCT, given that it's, like you said, only considering the specific utility costs against specific utility benefits, it will tend to show a higher economic potential than TRC.
And for DEP, it showed an increase in economic potential of 24%, 54%, and 2%. Would you agree with that?
I would have to look back in the report for the exact number, but yes, that sounds accurate.
And so given that UCT looks at cost effectiveness, again, from the utilities perspective, higher levels of cost effective energy efficiency or DSM, that means more cost savings for the utility when you're looking at the UCT test. Isn't that correct?
It does allow more measures, more energy efficiency measures or DSM measures to pass cost effectiveness screening tests and then allow them to be included in that economic potential. So it does create potentially, like you said, more opportunity. Things that might not have passed the TRC test could pass the UCT and then be included within the IRP potentially.
But Duke did not include those higher levels of savings potential from the UCT analysis when it developed its DSM cases in the IRP. Isn't that correct?
We did not directly do that, given that Nexan ran the economic potential using UCT as a sensitivity, but did not carry through how that would go all the way through to the achievable potential. But what we did do, and it does refer to this in the forecast methodology in my direct testimony, is that in discussion with stakeholders, there was a 10% adder put onto the potential that was identified, the achievable potential identified by TRC, to account for the fact that some of that additional economic potential could become additional achievable potential. But it just want to be clear that if a measure, you can't directly take the additional economic potential that you get from UCT and assume that achievable will increase by the same amount, because kind of like what we talked about before with the considering customer costs, like in the case of a heating and air measure, we might, let's say we're offering a rebate of $500 and the benefit to the utility exceeds $500, but a customer is still going to have to spend several $1,000s, even with receiving that rebate from us, to put that equipment in place. So the increased potential identified by using UCT for economic screening does not directly translate into an increase in achievable potential, because there is still customers still have to make that decision. But as you mentioned before, it also, customer has that other factors they can consider in, but it's, generally the adoption rate going from economic to achievable will be lower if you screened economic using UCT versus TRC. You would not convert as much of that economic potential to achievable on a percentage basis, because there are additional costs to customers and big obstacles to customers there. The incentives that we offer can help with that, but you would not assume that just because it passed UCT that a customer would adopt it.
But the companies in the market potential study, Nexan didn't analyze what the achievable potential under UCT would be. Isn't that right?
They did not carry the UCT screening methodology all the way through to achievable. They did not do that. That's correct. However, as we mentioned before, at the time that the study was performed, the UCT was not yet approved as the cost effectiveness test for South Carolina until the start of this year, and the study was concluded in the summer of 2020.
But Duke was planning to request that the commission adopt UCT as the primary cost effectiveness test at the time that the market potential study was being developed, was it not?
I don't know exactly when that request was made, but in recognition of the fact that that was a discussion that was ongoing within the collaborative and certainly something that was being considered, that was what prompted the NEXIM to do that 10% or do that sensitivity of redoing the economic screen with UCT, and then also why, when we did the forecast, we added in an additional 10% to the achievable potential to account for the fact that some of that additional economic potential would translate likely into achievable potential. So we did put in that addition, and that was discussed with the collaborative as well and throughout the stakeholder process.
And so you are aware then that collaborative participants did request that the company use UCT as the screening test used in the market potential study.
I was not a participant in the collaborative at that point in time. I was still in a different role, but my understanding is that it was discussed and requested, and that did lead to NEXIM performing that sensitivity, and then also us, like I said, incorporating that addition to the achievable potential.
Thank you, Mr. Bach. I have no further questions.
Thank you.
Johnson Development Associates.
Mr. Chairman, Court Walsh for Johnson Development, no questions.
Vote Solar.
Mr. Chairman, Vote Solar has no questions. Thank you.
Office of Regulatory Staff.
Mr. Chairman, Andrew Bateman with ORS, no questions. Thank you.
Commissioner questions. Commissioner Casper.
Mr. Chairman.
Commissioner Irvin.
Thank you. Thank you for your testimony today. To follow up on this, Nix's questions, I'd like a late file exhibit where you can carry that UTC all the way through. Is she questioning you about? That wouldn't be a difficult thing to submit, would it?
My understanding is that would require a basically revision to the entire market potential study from NEXIM's standpoint to develop that.
How much time would that take for you to complete?
Commissioner Irvin, excuse me, I might interject here. Jim Herndon, the actual expert with Nexant, will be on the stand at the rebuttal stage and might be able to more directly speak to these questions.
Okay, if the witness could answer the question, I'd like to hear his answer.
I don't have the expertise to say exactly how much work it would take for them. What I do know is that after the, as mentioned, that using the UCT for the economic screening stage, you would end up with a higher economic potential. From that point, then NEXIM goes through the process of estimating customer adoption of that economic potential, and that's where they come up with their achievable potential estimate. But as mentioned in when I was responding to the previous counsel, the adoption rate, or basically conversion rate from that economic to achievable, would tend to be lower if you used UCTs as a screen for the economic potential, given that it doesn't really, the UCT doesn't, only looks at the cost and benefit of the utility. It doesn't take into account cost benefit from the customer side. So there's many programs that would make sense from our standpoint. Basically, the size of the rebate that we would offer or the incentive is worth it from a utility standpoint, but the customer would still have to adopt that measure and get that rebate from us. Would potentially have to spend several $1,000s in the case of, let's say, like an air conditioner, or if someone was looking at, say, a heat pump water heater, they might have a couple $1,000 investment that they would have to be making. So just because we can offer it cost effectively doesn't mean customer adoption will be at a comparable level to when we did the TRC type screen.
Okay, well, if it can be modeled as a late filed exhibit, I'd like to see it just to have a complete record. If the company's unable to do that in this cycle, I'd like for them to be prepared to do it at our next IRP proceeding, so that we can have that information. Would that be an option?
I believe it would likely be an option, Commissioner. I would have to, as council mentioned, we would have to discuss with Jim Herndon. He would be able to speak to what that would, entail from a time and cost standpoint, to develop that additional work.
Okay, thank you, sir. No further questions.
Commissioner Caston.
Good afternoon, Mr. Bach.
Good afternoon, Commissioner.
Actually, this one question on page 6, where you talk about the design, the EE and DSN programs designed to be flexible. I know if one of our commissioners were here, I can't speak for her, but she'd probably ask something like this. You talk about flexible initiatives aimed at helping all customer classes. I assume you're referring to rate classes there, correct?
Rate class in terms of residential, commercial, industrial type. Is that?
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
In market segments use energy more wisely. Are there any programs, I guess, to help the lesser financially viable customer benefit from these programs?
The company does have low income, residential low income programs, which do provide energy saving options. Whether it's in the past has been certainly a lot with lighting programs. There's programs where they have home energy assessments done, looking for sources of inefficiency and provide additional incentives for potentially like insulation upgrades. The programs, they vary by jurisdiction, but the company does offer those low income programs in all of our jurisdictions and where approved. And the low income programs tend to be they tend to be, the cost effectiveness tends to be a little bit less, less strong with those programs, but we do make it a point to offer those, through our IRP or through our EE filings.
I can't remember where I heard it, but I remember hearing some percentages somewhere as far as adoption rates. And it seemed to be ubiquitous, and I don't know what they are, what they should be, and I don't remember.
Sure.
But do you know about what the adoption rates are across the whole customer base and then the, I guess, lower income customer base?
I don't have that information in front of me, although we do have program reporting that would be able to indicate that type of information, which we could get for you.
Alrighty, thank you. And on page 12 and 13, starting at page 12, and as briefly and as simply as you can explain it, lines 16 through 23. Tell me what that says.
Gotcha. Okay. The development of the high case forecast?
Based on feedback from stakeholders, high case forecast.
Yes. Okay. Right. So if in the discussion of the market potential study, the scenarios that we had Nexent run, they did their base scenario, which was essentially looking at our current program offerings, current incentive levels, current delivery methodologies, that sort of kind of a projection of if we kind of did business as usual, what would they think that EE adoption would look like in that base scenario. They also ran that enhanced case where they did a significant increase to incentives offered to customers, basically looked at program options to increase adoption. And then additionally, we did that high avoided energy cost scenario, which in this case, that was the high avoided energy cost was done off of the base case. But basically that was where you in doing your cost effectiveness screening, we used a 50% higher avoided energy cost, which could represent, some of those non-energy benefits that are being discussed. If someone were to, it could be a proxy in a sense for that. Let's say we had a carbon tax and that caused energy costs to be higher, or some other market condition caused higher costs. If energy costs are higher, that would tend to make more energy efficiency methods would pass the cost effectiveness screening. So we took basically the increase in customer adoption from both the enhanced case as well as the additional energy efficiency savings that were shown in that higher avoided energy cost case, basically the additional things that screened in and that we assume customers would adopt, basically kind of put both of those increases together, layered them on top of each other, basically to try to get the most optimistic case that we could do from a data-driven analysis for that high case.
Well, that's kind of the way I read it, but I think I read it in fewer words than that, but that's good. And in essence, what I think you just said and what I think I read is that you took based on the stakeholder input, the highest, the most rose-colored option, and that's what you used in the scenarios beyond, I guess, the base scenario as far as the aggressive EE and DSM.
I would have to look back at the specific, portfolio and scenario combinations, exactly which EE portfolio they used in each. But yes, in general, for the more aggressive cases, the high EE case was used, or the high EE forecast.
All right, page 13. This is going to be a test for you now. Lines 1 through 9, as briefly and as simply as you can. What is that saying?
Again, what we spoke to, like non-energy benefits, which could be, like you said, what we talked previously, there was a discussion of a customer might value, the making their contribution to the environment by doing things cleaner. Customers might have other things that drive them apart from purely an economic decision. So that's really what we get at with those non-energy benefits. They like to know that they're making a contribution, to the environment. So, basically, a lot of those, what they refer to as those non-energy benefits, there's not a ready or easy way to turn those into a direct financial calculation for doing cost effectiveness type comparisons. So using basically what we're trying to do there was that higher avoided energy cost scenario can kind of represent basically that incremental value that some customers would place on making energy efficiency investments. Basically, it'd be running that higher case with the higher avoided energy cost that allowed us to screen in basically additional measures as being cost effective, and then presume that there would be additional customer adoption of those. And that can be representative of that, non-energy benefits that some customers would do things that might be somewhat beyond a direct, cost benefit, economically. If it's something that would be economically viable from pure cost benefits, some will still make that investment, even if it's not a direct, benefit to them financially. Some will make an investment based on their personal convictions.
Okay, so let me see if I can summarize this. Stakeholders also requested the inclusion of non-energy benefits, which can represent environmental and societal benefits, which you do not currently have an assigned financial value. So you're saying that the inclusion of the high avoided energy cost to the high case forecast was the proxy that you used. Since you didn't have anything there, you said, well, let's just up this to kind of represent it best we can.
Yes, sir.
Okay. So that, as far as you know, is the higher guesstimate for a non-measurable thing at this point in time used for your 6 scenarios.
Yes, with that, we made that 50% increase in any avoided energy costs to account for, additional benefits that we don't have a way to quantify directly today.
All right. Well, thank you, Mr. Bach. Appreciate it.
Thanks, sir.
Any more questions for Mr. Bach?
Mr. Chairman, this is Delton Powers.
Commissioner Powers, you have the floor, sir.
Thank you. Mr. Bach, as been talked about earlier, it's a joint effort you're doing an IRP in South Carolina, you're doing one in North Carolina, and you're dealing with 2 different laws. You have the North Carolina Clean Energy Act, and you have our Act 62. which one of these two laws provide the most environmental benefits?
I don't have the expertise necessarily to answer that question directly. Not sure if one of the other witnesses might have a clear answer to that.
Well, which is tougher for as far as standards for Duke to meet? North Carolina, South Carolina?
I mean, this is my personal knowledge. I would expect that the clean energy plan that's being worked in North Carolina at present would be the more constraining. But as far as the exact details of how that plays out, I wouldn't want to overstate my knowledge on that.
That's all I have. Thank you.
Any more commissioner questions? Redirect for this witness.
Just one really limited thing, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Bach, Ms. Mixon noted that the proposal relating to transitioning to the UCT was being considered while the market potential study was being prepared. Can you just refresh us on the timeline as between when the market potential study was completed, when the IRP was finalized, and when the commission's order transitioning the companies from the TRC to the UCT
Yes.
was issued?
Yes, the study was completed in the analytical portion of the study was completed in May 2020. There were some final documents updated in June 2020. IRP was filed in September of 2020, and the change to UCT was approved by the commission in January of 2021.
Thank you very much. That's all I have, Mr. Chairman.
All right. Mr. Bach, you may step down from the witness stand.
Thank you, sir.
Ladies and gentlemen, it is 5:47. I want to stay true to my intent of finishing up each evening as close to 6 p.m. as possible. I do not believe we will be able to get through another witness in 12 minutes. I stand to be corrected. Applicant, do you think you could present a witness in 12 minutes?
No, sir, Mr. Chairman.
All right. So who are we going to start with tomorrow morning?
Tomorrow morning, Mr. Chairman, we'll start with Mr. Leon Brunson.
Okay, and if my order of witness presentation is correct, we have Mr. Leon Brunson, Mr. Matt Kalimba, and Mr. Nick Wintermantle tomorrow from the companies.
Yes, sir, I believe that's correct. And subject to Ms. Doolin, whether there's any clarification from her.
No, Mr. Chairman. No, Mr. Wilburn, that's correct. Thank you.
All right. Is there anything else we need to discuss before we leave for the evening? Okay. Hearing nothing, we're in recess until 9 a.m. tomorrow morning.